The gun was already pointed at her head when Aria realized she'd made the worst mistake of her life. 3 months ago, she was nobody. Invisible, drowning in debt, forgotten by a city that chewed up people like her and spit them out. Then Ethan Cade offered her a deal that seemed too good to be true. It was. Now she stood in a room full of criminals, holding evidence that could destroy them all, with nowhere to run and no one coming to save her. This is the story of how the girl who disappeared became the woman who refused to die. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights of the Summit Tower's employee entrance buzzed like angry wasps at 4:47 a.m. Aria Bennett's reflection in the glass doors showed a woman who'd learned to make herself small. Dark hair pulled back so tight it gave her headaches, uniform 2 sizes too large, shoulders curved inward like parentheses around a secret. She swiped her badge 3 times before the sensor registered her existence. Even the building seemed to forget she was there. Late again, Bennett. Marcus, the night supervisor, didn't look up from his phone. His voice carried the particular brand of boredom reserved for people whose only power came from a clipboard and a walkie-talkie. My shift starts at 5, Aria said quietly, in English so perfect it had taken her 6 years to sculpt every syllable into something that wouldn't betray where she'd come from. The accent she'd buried was just one more thing the city had taken from her. Early is on time. On time is late. Marcus finally glanced up, his eyes sliding over her like she was furniture. You're on the executive floors today, 40th through 45th. And Bennett, the Evans and Cade offices on 43. Don't touch anything except what you're supposed to clean. They have cameras everywhere. Evans and Cade. Even Marcus dropped his voice when he said the name, like speaking it too loud might summon something dark and expensive. Aria nodded, grabbed her cart of supplies, and headed for the service elevator. The wheels squeaked, a sound she'd stopped hearing months ago, the same way she'd stopped noticing the chemical burn of industrial cleaners on her hands or the ache that lived permanently in her lower back. Pain, like poverty, became background noise if you survived it long enough. The elevator climbed through the sleeping tower, each floor a tomb of dark glass and silent keyboards. Somewhere up there, people made more in a day than she made in a year. Somewhere up there, the world looked different, sharper, cleaner, full of choices that didn't all lead to the same slow drowning. She started on 40, working through the maze of cubicles with practiced efficiency, trash bins, vacuum lines in the carpet, Windex on the glass. Don't think, don't feel. Just move. By the time she reached 43, the sky outside the windows had shifted from black to that particular shade of gray that meant morning was coming whether you were ready or not. The Evans and Cade offices occupied the entire floor, a warren of dark wood and leather that smelled like money and secrets, the kind of space that made you straighten your spine involuntarily. Aria had cleaned here twice before. Both times the offices had been empty, the silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She'd moved through quickly, afraid that lingering too long might leave evidence of her presence, like a ghost who feared being caught haunting. Tonight was different. Light spilled from under one of the corner offices, the big one, the one with the view that turned the city into a glittering toy. Aria froze, her hand still on the handle of the vacuum. She checked her watch. 5:23 a.m. Who worked at this hour? Someone important enough not to follow anyone else's schedule. She should leave, come back later. But Marcus would dock her if she didn't finish the floor, and she couldn't afford to lose even an hour's pay. Not with the rent check bouncing and her mother's medication running out and the collection agency leaving messages that started polite and had recently turned threatening. Aria took a breath and made herself smaller, a skill she'd perfected over years of being somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. She'd clean around it, fast and silent, in and out, invisible, like always. She started in the conference room, working her way down the hallway toward that wedge of light. The vacuum's hum felt too loud, but she couldn't skip it. Marcus checked, and Marcus would know. As she moved closer, she heard something that made her hands still on the vacuum handle. Voices, raised, angry. Don't pay you to think, I pay you to execute. The first voice was cold, controlled, the kind of anger that didn't need volume to cut. Tell me again why the Camden deal is falling apart. The translations were wrong. The second voice cracked slightly, fear bleeding through professionalism. The Portuguese contracts. Someone changed the terms. By the time your team caught it, we'd already signed documents that left us exposed to a $14 million liability. The cold voice again, and Aria's translator brain, the part of her that never fully shut off, automatically cataloged the accent. American, East Coast money. The kind of English that came from prep schools and ski vacations. I'm going to ask you once more, who approved those translations? The agency we've used for 5 years. Fire them, today. And find me someone who won't cost me millions because they confused exclusive rights with shared licensing. Aria shouldn't have stopped, shouldn't have listened. But the translator, in her, the girl who'd once dreamed of working for the UN before debt and death had rewritten her future, couldn't help calculating the mistake. Portuguese had gendered contracts, one wrong article, one misplaced modifier, and the entire legal meaning shifted. It was the kind of error that happened when you hired bargain translators who ran text through software and called it good enough. She was still thinking about it when the door opened. The man who stepped into the hallway was younger than she'd expected from the voice. Mid-30s, maybe, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her car had before it died. Dark hair, sharp jawline, eyes like flint. He moved with the particular economy of motion that came from absolute certainty about your place in the world. Those eyes found her immediately. Aria did what she always did when someone important looked at her. She looked down, made herself smaller, tried to become part of the wall. Her hands gripped the vacuum handle hard enough to hurt. You. His voice was different when directed at her. Not warm exactly, but less cutting. Curious, maybe. How long have you been standing there? I'm sorry, sir. I'll come back. She was already backing away, her English suddenly feeling too careful, too constructed. I asked you a question. He walked closer, and Aria forced herself not to flinch. How long? A minute? Maybe less. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just... You speak Portuguese. It wasn't a question. Aria's stomach dropped. Sir, I wasn't trying to say... That's not what I asked. He was close enough now that she could see the details. The expensive watch, the shirt that probably cost a week of her wages, the faint shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. Do you speak Portuguese? The smart thing would be to lie. The safe thing. But Aria had never been good at lying, even when the truth cost her everything. Yes. Something shifted in his expression, interest, sharp and sudden. What else? I'm sorry? What other languages? His impatience was palpable, but controlled. Like everything about him was controlled. Spanish, French, Mandarin. She heard herself speaking, couldn't quite believe the words were coming out. Some Arabic, basic Russian. His eyes narrowed. Where did you learn? University, before... She stopped herself. Before her father died, before the debt, before she'd traded her future for survival. A long time ago. He was looking at her differently now. Not through her, but at her. Like she'd suddenly become visible in a way that made her want to disappear even more. What's your name? Aria Bennett. Ethan Cade. He didn't offer his hand. I have a problem, Aria Bennett. I need someone who can translate contract language from Portuguese to English without turning my legal documents into expensive disasters. Can you do that? This was insane. People like him didn't talk to people like her, didn't know she existed, I don't work in translation anymore, she said carefully. I work in maintenance. I can see that. His tone suggested the world was full of things that didn't make sense, and he was used to reordering them. But you have the skills I need. I'm asking if you can do the work. I'm sure there are agencies. The agencies failed me. I'm asking you. He pulled out his phone, typed something. Come to my office. 9 a.m. today. We'll discuss terms. Sir, I have another job. I work at a restaurant from 11 to close. Not anymore. He said it like he was canceling a subscription, not rearranging her entire life. If you're as good as I think you are, you won't need 2 jobs after today. Aria's translator brain was screaming warnings in 6 languages, but the desperate drowning part of her, the part that woke up at 3 a.m. calculating which bills she could afford to ignore, was doing different math. I can't just... 9 a.m., 43rd floor. Ask for me at reception. He was already walking away, back toward that wedge of light. Don't be late, Ms. Bennett. I don't offer twice. Then he was gone, and Aria was standing in a hallway that suddenly felt too bright, holding a vacuum cleaner and wondering if she'd just been offered a lifeline or a noose. Tut. The rest of her shift blurred. She finished the floor in a daze, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind spun in circles. By the time she clocked out at 8 a.m., she'd nearly convinced herself it hadn't happened, that exhaustion had conjured the whole encounter from stress and cleaning fumes. Then she checked her phone and found a message from an unknown number. Office 4301, 9 a.m. Don't make me come find you. Aria stood in the employee locker room, staring at her reflection in the scratched mirror. The woman looking back was 28 but looked older, hard around the edges, tired in the bones. She'd crossed an ocean to build a different life, buried her accent and her history, made herself invisible to survive. And now someone had seen her. The smart thing would be to ignore the message, go home, sleep, show up for her restaurant shift like nothing had changed. But Aria was tired of being smart, tired of being invisible, tired of drowning slowly when maybe, possibly, someone had just thrown her something that might keep her afloat. She went home to her studio apartment, 300 square feet of cracked linoleum and a window that looked out at a brick wall. Showered in water that ran cold because she'd turned the heater down to save money. Put on the only professional clothes she still owned, a black blouse with a loose button, gray pants that were slightly too big, shoes she'd bought at a thrift store and polished until they looked almost new. In the mirror, she looked like someone playing dress-up, trying to be something she wasn't anymore. She grabbed her bag. Inside, buried under her work uniform, was the portfolio she'd kept from her university days. Translation samples, proof that she'd once been good at this, that the life she'd been building had been real before it collapsed. On the bus ride back to Summit Tower, Aria kept her eyes on the window and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Rich men didn't help poor women without wanting something in return. Deals that sounded too good to be true always were. And people like Ethan Cade existed in a different world, one where the rules that protected normal people didn't apply. But desperation, Aria had learned, made you brave in the stupidest ways. Mont. The lobby of Summit Tower looked different during business hours, full of people in expensive suits moving with purpose, their confidence as polished as their shoes. Aria walked to the reception desk, feeling every eye on her even though no one was looking. I have a 9 o'clock with Ethan Cade, she said to the receptionist, a woman whose makeup was so perfect it looked architectural. The receptionist's professional smile flickered. Name? Aria Bennett. A pause while she typed. Then her eyebrows rose fractionally, the only crack in her composure. Take the elevator to 43. Someone will meet you. The elevator was different from the service one, mirror bright, silent, fast enough that Aria's stomach dropped. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that looked like it belonged in a different tax bracket entirely. Everything was dark wood and soft leather, the kind of quiet that money bought. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Aria's rent, appeared immediately. Miss Bennett, I'm Claire Westbrook, Mr. Cade's executive assistant. Follow me, please. Claire moved through the offices like a general through a battlefield, efficient, alert, missing nothing. Aria followed, acutely aware of how her thrift store shoes sounded on the hardwood, how her portfolio felt cheap under her arm. They stopped outside Office 4301. Claire knocked once, opened the door without waiting for a response. Miss Bennett is here. Send her in, Ethan's voice from inside. Claire gestured Aria forward, then closed the door behind her with a soft click that felt like a trap springing shut. The office was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a panorama, furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Everything arranged with the kind of precision that suggested someone cared deeply about control. Ethan sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a small boat, typing something on a laptop. He didn't look up immediately. Sit. Aria sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, her portfolio balanced on her knees like a shield. You came, Ethan said, still typing. I wasn't sure you would. You told me not to be late. People tell me a lot of things. Doesn't mean they listen. He closed the laptop, finally looking at her with that same sharp attention from the hallway. Tell me about your background. Aria had prepared for this, rehearsed it on the bus. I studied linguistics and international relations at Columbia. Graduated top of my program. I specialized in legal and technical translation with a focus on contract language and why are you cleaning offices at 4 in the morning? The question cut through her prepared speech like a blade. Aria's hands tightened on her portfolio. Life happened, she said carefully. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you. Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. Fair enough. Show me your work. Aria opened her portfolio with hands that wanted to shake. Inside were samples from her university days, from the brief period after graduation when she'd worked for a translation agency, before everything fell apart. She'd been good enough that professors had told her she had a real future, that organizations would fight over her. That had been 3 years ago. It felt like a different lifetime. Ethan took the portfolio, flipping through it with the kind of focus that suggested he actually understood what he was looking at. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of paper and the distant hum of the city outside. This is excellent work, he said finally. Why aren't you doing this anymore? I told you, life happened. You're wasting your degree scrubbing toilets. I'm surviving. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Not all of us get to choose how we pay our bills. No, Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. But some of us create opportunities instead of waiting for them. He closed the portfolio, pushed it back across the desk toward her. Aria's stomach sank. Here it came. The polite dismissal, the thanks but no thanks, the return to invisibility. I need a translator, Ethan said, someone who can handle sensitive documents, legal contracts, business communications, occasionally things that require discretion. The work would be irregular, sometimes daily, sometimes nothing for a week. But when I need you immediately, and I need absolute accuracy. Aria's heart was beating too fast. What's the pay? More than you're making now, significantly more. He named a figure that made her blink. But there are conditions. Of course there were. There were always conditions. What kind of conditions? Everything you translate stays confidential. You don't discuss it with anyone, not friends, not family, not a therapist. You sign an NDA that has teeth. You understand that the documents you'll be handling are often sensitive, sometimes dealing with significant sums of money and complicated relationships between parties who don't always trust each other. You're describing corporate translation work, Aria said. That's standard. I'm describing translation work that occasionally requires you to understand not just what's being said, but what's being hidden. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Can you do that? The smart answer was no. The safe answer. But Aria was done being smart and safe. Yes. Why should I believe you? Because I've spent 3 years making myself invisible, Aria said. I know how to see what people don't want seen. I know how to keep secrets. And I'm desperate enough to take this seriously and smart enough to do it right. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Interest, maybe, or recognition. I need someone who won't break under pressure, he said. Someone who can handle difficult situations without falling apart. Can you do that? Aria thought about 3 a.m. wake-ups and double shifts and the collection agency calls that started every day like a reminder that she was failing at staying alive. She thought about how invisible she'd made herself, how much she'd survived by refusing to break. Yes, she said, I can do that. Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, decision made. 3-month trial. Starting rate is what I quoted. You'll work out of an office here. I'll have Claire set you up with space and the equipment you need. You start Monday. Any questions? About 1,000. But Aria asked the only one that mattered. Why me? Because the agencies I've used are incompetent, and competence is expensive when you have to search for it. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Because you need the work, which means you'll take it seriously. And because when I asked you a direct question at 5 in the morning, you gave me a direct answer instead of what you thought I wanted to hear. He walked around the desk, extended his hand. Aria stood, shook it. His grip was firm, controlled. Everything about him was controlled. Don't make me regret this, Ms. Bennett. I won't. One more thing. He released her hand but didn't step back. The work you'll be doing, sometimes it will raise questions about the nature of what I do, about the people I work with. You're not being paid to ask those questions. You're being paid to translate accurately and keep your mouth shut. We clear? A warning delivered politely. Aria heard the threat underneath it, the reminder that this world had rules she didn't know yet. Crystal clear. Good. He moved back toward his desk, already pulling his attention to the next thing. Claire will get you set up with the paperwork. Welcome to Evans and Cade, Ms. Bennett. Aria walked out of his office with her portfolio under her arm and the feeling that she'd just stepped off the edge of something without checking how far the fall was. The next few days moved like a fever dream. Claire set her up with an office, small, but infinitely nicer than anywhere Aria had worked before. A computer, a desk, a window that looked out at the city instead of a brick wall. The NDA she signed was 23 pages of dense legal language that essentially boiled down to talk and will destroy you. She signed it anyway. Monday morning, she showed up at 8 a.m. in the same professional clothes, her stomach a knot of nerves and coffee. Claire met her with a stack of documents and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mr. Cade needs these translated from Portuguese by end of day, Claire said. They're Brazilian contract amendments, technical language, some financial terminology. He says you'll know what to do. Aria took the documents back to her small office, spread them across her new desk, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. The sharp, bright focus of doing work that actually used her brain. The translations took her 6 hours. She worked through lunch, her mind falling back into patterns she'd thought she'd lost. The documents were exactly what Ethan had said. Dense, legal, the kind of text where one wrong word could shift millions of dollars. The agency had made 16 separate errors in their previous translation, ranging from minor to catastrophic. Aria fixed all of them. When she delivered the corrected translations to Claire at 5 p.m., the assistant's professional mask slipped slightly. This is everything? Everything translated and proofed. I've marked the previous errors in red, my corrections in blue. If Mr. Cade has questions, I'm happy to walk him through the methodology. Claire took the documents, studied them briefly. He'll review tonight. You can go home, same time tomorrow. Aria rode the bus home feeling something dangerous and unfamiliar. Hope. The pattern established itself quickly. Each morning, Claire would deliver documents, contracts, emails, technical manuals, legal briefs, some in Portuguese, some in Spanish, occasionally French or Mandarin, always sensitive, always urgent, always requiring the kind of precision that Aria had trained for but never thought she'd use again. She was good at it, better than good. In the first 2 weeks, she caught 3 more agency errors that would have cost Evans and Cade serious money. By week 3, Ethan started requesting her specifically for rush jobs, and Claire's professional coolness had thawed into something approaching respect. The pay was exactly what Ethan had promised. Aria's first paycheck was more than she'd made in 2 months of double shifts. She paid her rent 3 months ahead, bought her mother's medication without having to choose which bills to ignore, called the collection agency and set up a payment plan that didn't make her want to throw up. For the first time in 3 years, she could breathe without feeling like she was drowning. But the work itself was beginning to raise questions, the kind Ethan had warned her not to ask. Most of the documents were legitimate business, contracts for international deals, correspondence with overseas partners, technical specifications for imports. But some of them had edges that didn't quite line up, references to merchandise that was never specifically described, financial transfers that seemed too complex, routed through too many intermediaries, language that was technically legal but felt designed to hide something underneath. Aria kept her mouth shut and did her job. She was being paid to translate, not to understand, and she needed this job too much to risk it with curiosity. Then, 4 weeks into her employment, Claire delivered a different kind of document. Mr. Cade needs this by tonight, the assistant said, her voice carefully neutral. It's marked Priority 1. The document was in Portuguese, but the letterhead was unfamiliar. No corporate logo, no official designation. Just an address in Sao Paulo and a name Aria didn't recognize. The content was dense, technical, full of shipping terminology and cargo manifests. On the surface, it looked like a standard logistics document. But Aria's translator brain, trained to see patterns, to understand context, kept snagging on phrases that didn't quite fit, shipping routes that took strange detours, cargo descriptions that were simultaneously too specific and too vague, references to special handling and discreet transport. She translated it exactly as written, her hands steady even as her suspicions grew. That evening, as she was packing up to leave, her office door opened without a knock. Ethan stood in the doorway, the translated document in his hand. "You have questions," he said. Not asking, stating. Aria's mouth went dry. "I'm paid to translate, not to ask questions." "But you have them anyway." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him. The small office suddenly felt very small indeed. "I can see it in the translation. You're too careful with certain phrases, like you're trying not to understand what you're reading. I translated accurately. You translated perfectly. That's not what I'm talking about." He set the document on her desk, his hand flat on top of it. "I told you this work would require discretion, but discretion requires trust, and trust requires honesty. So I'm going to ask you directly, what do you think you're translating?" The smart answer was nothing, the safe answer. But Ethan was looking at her with that same sharp attention from their first meeting, and Aria was tired of being smart and safe. "Something illegal," she said quietly. "Or close enough that it needs to be hidden in language that looks legal." She waited for anger, for the immediate termination, the threats to keep her quiet, the reminder of the NDA she'd signed. Instead, Ethan nodded slowly. "Good. You're smarter than the last 3 translators I hired. Am I fired?" "No." He pulled out the chair across from her desk, sat down like they were about to have a reasonable conversation. "But we're going to have a different kind of discussion now. One where I'm honest with you, and you decide whether you can live with what I tell you." Aria's heart was pounding. "I don't think I want to know." "Too late. You already figured it out." He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Evans and Cade does legitimate business, millions of dollars in legal international trade. But some of our partners operate in gray areas. They move goods that exist in regulatory gaps, not explicitly illegal, but not exactly clean. Our job is to facilitate those movements in ways that keep everyone out of court and out of jail. That's money laundering. That's careful accounting." His voice was patient, like he was explaining something obvious. "The documents you translate help us navigate international regulations that are often contradictory or deliberately vague. We're not smuggling drugs or weapons. We're helping businesses move goods across borders in ways that minimize tax exposure and regulatory friction. By lying about what's in the cargo, by describing it in language that's technically accurate but strategically imprecise." He watched her carefully. "Does that distinction matter to you?" Aria thought about her bank account, finally out of the red, about her mother's medication, purchased without panic, about sleeping through the night without waking up calculating which bills she could afford to ignore. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's a better answer than most people give." Ethan stood, straightened his jacket. "You have 2 choices, Ms. Bennett. Walk away now with a severance package and a strong recommendation for your next job. Or stay, understand exactly what you're part of, and continue being paid very well to help us do it carefully." "If I walk away?" "The NDA still applies. You never talk about what you translated. Beyond that, we part ways professionally, and you move on with your life." "And if I stay?" "You become part of something that operates in the spaces between legal and illegal. It's not safe. It's not clean, but it pays extremely well, and I keep my people protected as long as they're loyal." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You don't have to decide tonight, but by Monday, I need an answer." He left, and Aria sat in her small office, staring at the document on her desk, the words she'd translated so carefully, now carrying a weight she couldn't quite measure. That weekend was the longest of her life. Aria walked through her tiny apartment, cleaned surfaces that were already clean, tried to sleep, and couldn't. She made lists of pros and cons, argued with herself in 3 languages, tried to calculate the math of her soul versus her survival. The smart thing was to walk away. Take the severance, find legitimate work, sleep at night, without wondering if she was an accessory to something that would eventually blow up in her face. But the smart thing wouldn't pay her mother's medical bills, wouldn't clear the debt that had been choking her for 3 years, wouldn't give her back the life that had been stolen when her father died and left her with nothing but his mistakes and his debts. Ethan was offering her a lifeline. The fact that it came with moral compromise was just the price of surviving in a city that didn't care if you drowned. Monday morning, Aria showed up at her office at 8 a.m. sharp. Claire was already there, a carefully neutral expression on her face. "Mr. Cade is expecting you," the assistant said. "Office 4301. Ethan was standing by his window when she entered, looking out at the city with his hands in his pockets. He didn't turn around. "What's your answer, Miss Bennett?" Aria closed the door behind her, her hands steady even though her heart was racing. "I stay," she said. "But I have conditions." Now he turned, his eyebrows raising fractionally. "You're negotiating. You said trust requires honesty. So I'm being honest. I'll do this work, but I need to understand the limits. What you will and won't ask me to be part of. What happens if things go wrong? What protection I have if someone decides to clean house and I'm considered loose ends." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then smiled. A real smile, the first she'd seen from him. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "I'm very desperate," Aria corrected, "but I'm not suicidal. I need to know what I'm walking into." "Fair enough." He gestured to the chairs by his desk, and they both sat. "The limits. You translate documents. You occasionally attend meetings where your language skills are needed. You never handle the goods directly, never deal with money, never make decisions about what we move or how we move it. Your job is pure translation. And if the documents I translate are about something explicitly illegal, drugs, weapons, we don't touch drugs or weapons. That's a hard line for me." His voice was firm, absolute. "What we do exists in gray areas: regulatory arbitrage, strategic corporate structuring, helping goods move through complicated international frameworks. It's not clean, but it's not violent." "Who decides what's gray enough?" "I do. And when you're not sure, you ask me directly, and I give you a straight answer." He leaned forward slightly. "As for protection, you work for me, which means you're protected as long as you're loyal. If something goes wrong, if someone comes asking questions, you don't know anything beyond what you translated. We have lawyers on retainer whose job is to keep employees insulated from exactly those situations. And if I want out, then you come to me, give me notice, finish whatever projects are in progress, and walk away with references and a severance package. No drama, no threats." His eyes were steady on hers. "I'm not in the business of threatening employees, Ms. Bennett. I'm in the business of running a profitable operation. Fear makes people unreliable. Loyalty through respect works better." Aria wanted to believe him, wanted to believe this was just a job, that the lines he drew were real, that she could survive this without losing pieces of herself she wouldn't get back. "One more condition," she said. "If you ever ask me to translate something that crosses a line I can't live with, I get to say no. Once. Without consequences." Ethan considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Once," he agreed. "But you use it wisely, because once it's gone, it's gone." "Deal." They shook hands. The second time, but this one felt different, like she was sealing something more permanent than a job offer, like she was signing away a part of herself she wouldn't get back. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was almost normal. Aria translated documents, attended meetings, learned the particular vocabulary of international trade conducted in shadows. She met other members of Ethan's team, quiet professionals who did their jobs with the same careful discretion she was learning to adopt. She learned to read between lines, to understand when merchandise meant electronics gray-marketed out of tariff zones, when special handling meant customs officials who looked the other way for the right consideration. She learned that Ethan's empire was built on information and relationships, on knowing which regulations had loopholes and which officials had prices. It wasn't violent, it wasn't drugs or weapons or the dark things she'd feared, but it wasn't clean either. And at night, Aria sometimes lay awake wondering at what point translation became complicity, at what point keeping quiet became guilt. But her bank account grew, her debts shrank, her mother's medication arrived on time, every time. And slowly, carefully, Aria started to feel like maybe she could breathe without drowning. Then, 2 months into her employment, everything changed. It started with a document that arrived late on a Thursday afternoon, marked Priority 1, Claire's expression more carefully neutral than usual. The letterhead was new, an organization Aria didn't recognize with an address in Macau. The content was dense, technical, full of shipping routes and cargo manifests and financial transfers. On the surface, it looked like everything else she'd translated. But as Aria worked through it, phrase by phrase, something nagged at her. The routes were wrong, too circuitous, touching ports that didn't make sense for the cargo described. The financial transfers were structured in ways that suggested hiding the money was more important than efficiency. And buried in the middle of the document, in a paragraph dense with technical terminology, was a reference that made her hands still on the keyboard. A name. Marcus Webb. She knew that name. Knew it from other documents she'd translated. Knew it as one of Ethan's senior partners. A man she'd met once, briefly, at a meeting. Quiet, professional, the kind of person who blended into the background. But in this document, Marcus Webb's name appeared in a context that didn't fit. References to alternative arrangements and independent initiatives and revised percentage allocations. Aria read it 3 times, her translator brain picking apart the careful language, understanding what it was designed to hide. Marcus Webb was skimming, setting up side deals, using Ethan's infrastructure to move his own goods, pocketing profits that should have been going to the company. And he was doing it carefully, burying the evidence in documents so dense and technical that most translators would miss it entirely. But Aria wasn't most translators. She sat back from her computer, her heart racing. This was exactly the kind of information Ethan had warned her about. Things that raised questions she wasn't being paid to ask. But this was different. This was someone betraying Ethan from inside, using the same gray area operations to steal from him. And if she stayed quiet, if she just translated the document and kept her mouth shut. She didn't know Marcus Webb, didn't owe him anything, but she knew what happened to people who betrayed men like Ethan Cade, knew that the careful professionalism and controlled anger covered something much darker. If she told Ethan what she'd found, Marcus Webb would pay for it, maybe violently, definitely permanently. If she stayed quiet, she was complicit in the theft. And eventually, when Ethan discovered it, and men like him always discovered these things, he'd wonder why his translator hadn't caught it. Aria stared at her computer screen, at the careful Portuguese phrases that hid betrayal underneath, and realized she'd reached the moment where she had to choose what kind of person she was going to be. The smart thing was to stay quiet, the safe thing. But Aria was tired of being smart and safe. She saved the document, marked it with careful notes, and went to find Ethan Cade. Ethan's office was dark except for the desk lamp casting a pool of amber light across the scattered papers in front of him. It was past 8 in the evening. The city beyond his windows transformed into a constellation of lights that made the darkness between buildings feel infinite. He looked up when Aria knocked, and something in her expression made him set down his pen immediately. "Ms. Bennett, I thought you'd left hours ago. I found something." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She was clutching a folder against her chest like it might shield her from what came next. In the Macau document, something you need to see. Ethan's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, a subtle straightening that suggested full attention. "Close the door." Aria did, her pulse hammering in her throat. She crossed to his desk, set the folder down, opened it to the pages she'd marked. Her annotations were color-coded, meticulous, the kind of work that showed she'd been thorough. "The manifest on page 7, she said, pointing. "It references a shipment routing through Singapore and Jakarta before reaching Macau. But the cargo described, electronics components, that route doesn't make sense. Singapore to Macau direct is standard. Adding Jakarta creates unnecessary delays and customs touchpoints." Ethan pulled the document closer, his eyes scanning the Portuguese text. "Go on." "The financial structure is also wrong. The percentages allocated to various accounts, they're structured to obscure the actual profit distribution. Someone's routing money through intermediaries that aren't in your standard corporate framework." She flipped to another page. And here, on page 12, there's a reference to revised partnership allocations that mentions Marcus Webb coordinating with external partners on terms that differ from your standing agreements. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ethan's face remained perfectly controlled, but his eyes went cold in a way that made Aria's survival instinct scream at her to run. "You're telling me Marcus is stealing from me?" I'm telling you, the language in this document suggests he's operating parallel deals using your infrastructure. Aria's translator brain kicked in, choosing words with the same precision she used for legal contracts. Whether that constitutes theft depends on the specifics of your partnership agreements, which I haven't seen. But the financial routing is designed to hide something, and his name appears in contexts that suggest independent action. Ethan read through the document again, slower this time, his jaw tight. The silence stretched so long that Aria started to wonder if coming here had been a catastrophic mistake. Maybe she'd misread the language. Maybe this was normal and she'd just exposed her ignorance about how his business actually worked. Maybe, how certain are you? Ethan's voice was quiet, controlled, dangerous. About the translation? Completely certain about what it means. Aria chose her words carefully. Certain enough that if I were you, I'd want to verify it before doing anything irreversible. He looked up at her then, his expression unreadable. You could have ignored this, translated it straight and kept your mouth shut. Yes. Why didn't you? Because I'm complicit enough without being complicit in my own blindness, Aria thought. Because once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and staying quiet would have made me something I don't want to be. Because you pay me to translate accurately, she said instead. That includes context. This document's context is wrong, and you deserve to know that. Ethan studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, reassessment maybe, or a recalibration of who he thought she was. Go home, Ms. Bennett. You did the right thing bringing this to me. He closed the folder, his movements precise. And Aria, don't mention this to anyone, not Claire, not other staff, no one. Understood? Understood. She left his office with her legs shaking, rode the elevator down to the lobby, and walked out into the cold night air feeling like she'd just lit a fuse without knowing how long it would burn. The next day, Marcus Webb didn't show up for work. Neither did the two junior associates who worked most closely with him. Claire's expression was even more carefully neutral than usual, and the office felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Aria kept her head down and did her work. Translated documents, attended meetings, pretended she didn't notice the way conversations stopped when she entered the break room, the way people looked at her like she was a variable they hadn't accounted for. On the third day, Ethan called her into his office. He looked like he hadn't slept, shadows under his eyes, his tie loosened, jacket discarded over the back of his chair. There was a bottle of expensive scotch on his desk, 2 glasses, one of them half empty. Sit, he said, and Aria sat. Ethan poured scotch into the second glass, pushed it across the desk toward her. You were right. Marcus was running side deals through our shipping routes, skimming profits, using our customs contacts for his own merchandise. We're talking about $7 million over 18 months. Aria's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the glass. She didn't drink it. What happened to him? He's gone. Out of the company, out of the city, out of my life. Ethan's voice was flat, emotionless. The associates who helped him are gone too. We've restructured the financial routing, closed the loopholes, put new verification protocols in place. That's it? He just leaves? What did you expect? A body in the river? Ethan's smile was sharp, humorless. I'm a businessman, Ms. Bennett, not a gangster. Marcus signed contracts with non-compete clauses and financial penalty structures. Breaking those contracts cost him everything he'd stolen plus punitive damages. He's ruined professionally and financially, which is a slower death than a bullet, but much more legally defensible. Aria took a sip of the scotch. It burned going down, smoother than anything she'd ever tasted. Why are you telling me this? Because you saved me $7 million and prevented a problem that could have become much worse. Ethan leaned back in his chair, regarding her with that same sharp attention. And because you earned the right to know what happened after you stuck your neck out. I didn't stick my neck out. I just did my job. You did more than your job. You made a choice that could have backfired badly if you'd been wrong, or if I'd been the kind of man who shoots the messenger. He refilled his own glass. That took either courage or faith. Which was it? Aria thought about it, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. Desperation. I need this job too much to let someone else's theft destroy it. Honest answer. Ethan raised his glass slightly. Here's to enlightened self-interest. They drank, and for the first time since Aria had met him, Ethan Cade looked almost human, tired, frustrated, but somehow more real than the perfectly controlled businessman who never let anything crack his surface. "I'm increasing your salary," he said abruptly. "Effective immediately. Consider it a bonus for competence and discretion." "That's not necessary. It's not a favor. It's compensation." His tone left no room for argument. "You proved you're more valuable than I initially assessed. Your pay should reflect that." Aria set down her glass, her hands finally steady. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Earn it." But his voice had lost its edge, and when he looked at her, it was with something that might have been respect. "You're dismissed, Ms. Bennett. Go home. Get some sleep. You look like hell. You're not exactly fresh yourself." The corner of his mouth quirked up. "Get out of my office." Aria left, but she carried the weight of that conversation with her. The knowledge that she'd crossed another line, that she was deeper in Ethan Cade's world than she'd intended to be, and that somewhere along the way she'd stopped being just an employee and become something more complicated. The weeks that followed were different. Ethan started requesting her presence in meetings that went beyond pure translation work, strategy sessions where her understanding of language bled into understanding people, negotiations where reading subtext mattered as much as reading text. She sat in rooms with men in expensive suits discussing deals that skirted legality, and she learned to keep her face neutral while her brain cataloged every lie and half-truth. She was good at it, better than she wanted to be. Claire stopped treating her like temporary staff and started treating her like someone who mattered. The other employees gave her space, respect, the careful courtesy reserved for people close to power. And Ethan started asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with translation. "What do you think?" he'd say, after explaining a complicated deal structure. "Does this hold up in Portuguese legal framework?" Or, "Read this email thread. Tell me if I'm missing something in the tone." Or, "You grew up speaking 3 languages. When someone switches between them in conversation, what are they hiding?" Aria answered honestly, and slowly, carefully, she realized that Ethan valued her not just for her skills, but for her perspective, the outsider's view, the immigrant's understanding of how people presented different faces in different languages, the translator's instinct for what was being said beneath the words. It was intoxicating being seen like that, being valued for her mind instead of just her labor. And it was dangerous because the more valuable she became, the more she knew, and the more she knew, the harder it would be to walk away. One evening, 3 months into her employment, Aria was working late on a complex contract when Ethan appeared in her office doorway. He'd loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, the closest she'd seen him come to casual. "Still here?" he asked. "This contract is a nightmare. The Brazilian legal language doesn't map cleanly to U.S. corporate law, and whoever drafted it deliberately exploited the gaps." She gestured at her screen, frustrated. "I'm trying to translate it in a way that preserves both the technical accuracy and the strategic ambiguity, but it's like trying to paint the same picture in 2 different color palettes." Ethan walked into her office, came around behind her desk to look at the screen. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "Show me the problem section." Aria pulled up the relevant paragraph, walked him through the linguistic gymnastics required to maintain the document's careful vagueness. As she explained, Ethan asked questions that showed he actually understood the nuances, that he wasn't just humoring her but genuinely engaged with the intellectual puzzle of it. "What if we restructure it like this?" He leaned over her shoulder, pointed at a specific phrase. "Use the gerund form here, which exists in both languages but carries slightly different implications. It preserves the ambiguity while making the translation technically defensible." Aria considered it, then nodded slowly. "That works. That actually works perfectly." She made the change, and the paragraph suddenly clicked into place. Accurate, strategic, clean. "How did you know that?" she asked, turning to look at him. He was still standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I pay attention when smart people explain things," Ethan said. "And you're very smart, Aria." It was the first time he'd used her first name outside of a warning or a direct question. The intimacy of it made something flutter in her chest, dangerous, unwanted, definitely unprofessional. "I should finish this," she said, her voice coming out softer than she'd intended. You should. But Ethan didn't move, and neither did she. And for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something that had nothing to do with translation work. Then his phone buzzed, breaking the spell. He stepped back, pulled it out, glanced at the screen. His expression shifted, back to business, back to the controlled mask. Emergency meeting, I need you there. He was already moving toward the door. Bring your laptop. We're meeting someone who only speaks Mandarin, and I need real-time translation. Aria grabbed her things and followed him, her heart still racing from whatever had almost happened in her office. The meeting was in a private room at an upscale restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where the prices weren't listed on the menu because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. Ethan's guest was already seated when they arrived. A Chinese businessman in his 50s, impeccably dressed, accompanied by two quiet men who radiated the particular alertness of professional security. Ethan introduced Aria in Mandarin that was functional but accented, then switched to English. Ms. Bennett will be translating for us tonight. She has my complete confidence. The businessman, Mr. Chen, though Aria suspected that wasn't his real name, studied her with eyes that missed nothing. Then he spoke in rapid Mandarin, his tone polite but his words designed to test. Your employer trusts you to hear sensitive business discussions. Should I? Aria responded in Mandarin that was fluent, native level, with the particular Beijing accent that suggested education and sophistication. Mr. Chen, I translate words. What you choose to say is your decision, but I will render your meaning faithfully, and I will forget what I hear the moment I leave this room. Something shifted in Chen's expression. Approval, maybe, or at least acceptance. He nodded once and switched into business mode. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in negotiation conducted through 3 languages. Chen spoke Mandarin. Ethan responded in English. Aria translated both directions with the kind of precision that required not just language skills, but cultural understanding, knowing when to translate literally and when to adjust phrasing to preserve intent across different business cultures. They were discussing a shipping partnership that would move electronics manufactured in Shenzhen through a complicated route involving Singapore, the Philippines, and eventually the United States. The details were dense, technical, full of the kind of careful language that Aria had learned to recognize as gray area operations. But there was something else happening beneath the business discussion, a subtle testing, a feeling out of boundaries and trustworthiness. Chen would make a statement that seemed straightforward, then watch Ethan's reaction carefully. Ethan would respond with equal care, and Aria realized she was translating not just a negotiation, but a complicated dance of power and respect. Halfway through dinner, Chen switched tactics entirely. He spoke directly to Aria in Mandarin, his tone conversational. You translate very well. Where did you learn? University, Aria responded, knowing Ethan couldn't understand but trusting he'd wait for translation. And from living in 3 countries before I was 18. An immigrant's education. Valuable. Chen's smile didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, does your employer know that you understand more than you translate, that you see the patterns beneath the words? It was a trap, elegantly laid. If she said yes, she was admitting to analyzing beyond her role. If she said no, she was lying, and Chen would know it. Mr. Cade hired me because I'm excellent at my job, Aria said carefully. Part of excellence is understanding context. Another part is knowing when context should remain unspoken. Chen laughed, a genuine sound. Then he switched back to business Mandarin and continued the negotiation as if the test had never happened. When they finally left the restaurant 3 hours later, Ethan was quiet during the car ride back to the office. Aria sat beside him in the back of the town car, reviewing her notes, trying not to think about how close their shoulders were or how the darkness outside made the interior feel intimate. What did Chen ask you? Ethan said finally. When he spoke to you directly. He wanted to know if I understood more than I translated. What did you tell him? That understanding context is part of my job. That knowing when to keep quiet about that context is the other part. Ethan turned to look at her, his face half-shadowed in the passing streetlights. And he accepted that? He laughed. Then he agreed to your terms with only minor modifications. Aria closed her laptop. I think he was testing whether you'd hired someone competent or just someone decorative. And what's his verdict? Competent. Possibly too competent for my own good. She met Ethan's eyes. He warned me in a very polite way that seeing too much can be dangerous. He's right. Ethan's voice was quiet, serious. Are you scared? Aria thought about it, really thought about it. 3 months ago, she'd been invisible, drowning, desperate. Now she sat in the back of a luxury car next to a man who operated in the shadows of international commerce, translating conversations that could probably land everyone involved in prison if the wrong people ever heard them. Yes, she said honestly, but I'm more scared of going back to cleaning offices at 4 a.m. and wondering if I'll make rent. That's not your only choice anymore. You could find legitimate translation work. With your skills and my recommendation, you'd have offers. Why are you telling me this? Because I need to know you're here by choice, not just desperation. Ethan's expression was difficult to read. Desperate people make mistakes when they start feeling trapped. I need people who know what they've chosen and have made peace with it. The car pulled up to Summit Tower, empty and dark except for security lights. Aria gathered her things, then paused with her hand on the door handle. I'm here by choice, she said. It's not a choice I'm proud of, but it's mine. Ethan nodded slowly. Good. Because tomorrow I need you to do something that's going to test exactly how much choice you're comfortable with. He didn't elaborate, and Aria didn't ask. She went home to her apartment that wasn't quite so tiny anymore, lay in her bed that had actual sheets instead of the cheap ones that pilled after 3 washes, and stared at the ceiling wondering when exactly she'd stopped being a translator and started being whatever she was becoming. The next morning, Claire was waiting at Aria's office with an expression that suggested the day was about to get complicated. Mr. Cade needs you in conference room A, immediately. Conference room A was the largest, the one with the view and the table that seated 20. When Aria arrived, Ethan was there with 4 other men she recognized from previous meetings. Senior partners, the ones who handled the most sensitive operations. They all looked tense. Ms. Bennett, Ethan gestured to the empty chair beside him. We have a situation that requires your expertise. Aria sat, her stomach nodding. The 4 men were watching her with expressions ranging from skeptical to actively hostile. She recognized the dynamic immediately. She was the outsider, the new variable, the unknown quantity they didn't trust. Gentlemen, some of you haven't worked directly with Ms. Bennett yet, Ethan continued, his tone allowing no argument. She's been handling our Portuguese and Mandarin translation work for the past 3 months. She's also the one who identified the discrepancies in Marcus Webb's operations. That got their attention. The hostile expression shifted slightly, still wary, but with a threat of respect. What's the situation? Aria asked, keeping her voice professional. Ethan slid a folder across the table to her. We've intercepted communications suggesting that one of our shipping partners is planning to renegotiate our standing agreement. Not through official channels, through a hostile takeover of our Manila routes. Aria opened the folder. Inside were printouts of email exchanges in Spanish, Portuguese, and what looked like Tagalog. You need these translated? We need them analyzed. It was one of the other men speaking now, Richard something, she thought, though she'd never been formally introduced. Translation is just the first step. We need to understand their actual plan, their timeline, their weak points. That's intelligence analysis, not translation. Can you do it? Ethan asked directly. Aria looked at the documents, her brain already parsing the languages, seeing patterns in the phrasing. This wasn't just business correspondence. This was planning, strategy, people coordinating an attack on Ethan's operations. Yes, she said, but I need context. Details about the current partnership structure, the assets at stake, the personalities involved. For the next 6 hours, Aria sat in that conference room translating, analyzing, building a picture of a hostile takeover disguised as a renegotiation. The men around her provided context, filled in gaps, asked questions that pushed her to dig deeper. And slowly, carefully, a pattern emerged. The shipping partner, a Filipino company with deep political connections, wasn't just trying to renegotiate. They were systematically creating conditions that would force Ethan's company out of the Manila market entirely, then swooping in to take over the routes and the customs relationships that made those routes valuable. It was elegant, brutal, and probably legal enough to survive scrutiny. They're using regulatory compliance as a weapon, Aria explained, pointing to a specific email exchange. See here, they've filed complaints with customs officials about supposed irregularities in your documentation. Nothing that will stick, but enough to create delays and increase scrutiny. Then they're positioning themselves as the compliant alternative when your routes become too expensive to maintain. How long do we have? Ethan asked. Based on the timeline in these emails, 3 weeks before the regulatory pressure becomes unmanageable. Maybe 4 if you can delay the customs investigations. The men around the table exchanged looks, grim, calculating. Richard leaned forward. Can we counterfile complaints against them? They've already inoculated themselves, Aria said, flipping to another document. Their operations are clean, or at least clean enough that any investigation would take months to find problems. You'd be fighting a defensive battle while they control the offensive. So what do we do? Another man, James, she thought, his voice tight with frustration. Aria looked at the documents spread across the table, her translator brain working through the problem like it was a linguistic puzzle. You make them an offer they can't refuse, but you make it look like their idea. Everyone stared at her. Ethan's expression was unreadable. Explain, he said quietly. They want the Manila routes because they're profitable. But what they really want is the customs relationships that make those routes work. You can't give them that without destroying your own position. But you can offer them a partnership that gives them access to those relationships while keeping your control. We've already rejected their partnership proposals, Richard said dismissively, because their proposals were designed to give them leverage. But if you make a counter-proposal that looks like a merger but is actually a containment strategy, Aria pulled out a blank sheet of paper, started sketching a structure. You create a subsidiary company that handles Manila operations. They get ownership stake that looks substantial but is actually minority position with limited decision-making power. You structure the voting rights so you maintain control while giving them enough profit share to make the hostile takeover unnecessary. She looked up from her sketch to find everyone staring at her. That's not translation work, James said slowly. No, Aria agreed, but it's based on understanding what they actually want versus what they're saying they want. The language in their communications reveals their true priorities. They're not trying to destroy you. They're trying to maximize profit while minimizing risk. Give them a path to do that without the hostile takeover, and they'll take it. Silence around the table. Then Ethan smiled, sharp, satisfied, dangerous. Draft the proposal, he said to Richard. Use Ms. Bennett's structure. We'll present it as a response to their regulatory concerns, position it as our attempt to ensure compliance, and strengthen the partnership. The meeting broke up shortly after, the men filing out with the controlled urgency of people who had a battle plan and a deadline. Aria started gathering the documents, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. Miss Bennett, Ethan's voice stopped her. Stay a moment. She sat back down. The conference room suddenly felt very large with just the two of them. That was impressive, Ethan said. Where did you learn to think like that? I didn't learn it. Aria struggled to explain. Translation isn't just about words. It's about understanding what people mean versus what they say. Understanding their motivations, their cultural context, their strategic positioning. This was the same thing, just applied to business instead of conversation. You have a gift for this. He was looking at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. For seeing patterns, for understanding what people want. Is that a compliment or a warning? Both. Ethan stood, walked to the windows overlooking the city. You're becoming more valuable to me than I anticipated. That's good for your career, but it's also dangerous. Why? Because valuable people become targets. He turned to face her. If our competitors find out that you're more than just a translator, that you're analyzing their communications, identifying their strategies, they'll either try to buy you or eliminate you as a threat. Aria's mouth went dry. Eliminate. Not violently, probably. Ethan's expression was serious. Corporate espionage is a gray area, but people protect their interests, and you're becoming a significant liability to anyone operating against us. So what do I do? You stay close to me. You don't take meetings alone with anyone you don't know. You're careful about what you say and who hears it. He moved closer, his voice dropping. And you trust that I protect what's mine. The possessiveness in that statement should have alarmed her. Instead, it felt oddly reassuring, like maybe in this dangerous world she'd stumbled into, having someone powerful claim her as their responsibility was safer than being adrift. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," Ethan echoed. Then more gently, "Go home, Aria. You did excellent work today. Rest. Tomorrow we start implementing your strategy." Aria left feeling like she'd crossed another line, from translator to strategist, from employee to something more integral. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, and when she stepped out into the lobby, she had the sudden paranoid sense of being watched. She shook it off. Exhaustion and adrenaline, making her see threats that weren't there. But as she walked to the subway, Aria didn't notice the man in the gray suit who'd been sitting in the lobby, who stood up when she left, who followed her at a careful distance all the way to her apartment building. She didn't notice him take photos of where she entered. She didn't notice him make a phone call in rapid Tagalog, describing her appearance and address to whoever was listening on the other end. Aria went to sleep that night thinking she'd just become indispensable. She had no idea she'd also just become a target. The weeks following Aria's strategic intervention moved with a velocity that left her breathless. The proposal she'd sketched on paper in that conference room became a 50-page document drafted by lawyers, refined by financial analysts, and presented to the Filipino shipping company with the kind of careful choreography that made hostile negotiations look like friendly partnerships. Ethan had insisted she attend the actual negotiation, held in a private dining room at Per Se, overlooking Central Park. Aria sat beside him at a table where the silverware probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget used to, translating not just words, but the subtle shifts in tone that revealed what the other side actually wanted versus what they claimed to want. The lead negotiator for the Filipino company was a woman named Teresa Reyes, sharp-eyed and silver-haired, who spoke English perfectly but preferred Tagalog for anything that mattered. She'd looked at Aria with the kind of assessment that suggested she knew exactly what role the young translator played in Ethan's organization. "Your proposal is interesting," Teresa said in Tagalog, her eyes on Ethan even though he couldn't understand without translation. "It gives us access without control, profit without power. Why should we accept limitations when we could take everything?" Aria translated faithfully, watching Ethan's face remain perfectly neutral. Then he responded, and Aria rendered his English into equally precise Tagalog. "Because taking everything requires destroying me first, and I'm significantly harder to destroy than you anticipated. This proposal gives you profit, partnership, and the customs relationships you actually want, without the risk and expense of a hostile takeover that might fail." Ethan's voice was calm, reasonable, the tone of someone stating facts rather than making threats. "You're smart business people. Calculate the expected value of war versus the guaranteed value of partnership." Teresa smiled, a sharp expression that suggested respect. "Your translator understands subtext very well. Does she also understand that we could make her a more profitable offer? Someone with her skills is valuable." It was a test, and everyone at the table knew it. Aria kept her voice steady as she translated Teresa's words to Ethan, then waited for his response. "Ms. Bennett isn't for sale," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "But I appreciate you recognizing her value. It's why she helped design this proposal. She understands what you actually need better than most." The negotiation lasted 3 hours, with breaks for wine pairings and courses that arrived with the kind of precision that suggested the kitchen knew exactly how long business discussions took. By the time dessert appeared, they'd reached an agreement that gave the Filipino company substantial profit participation in the Manila routes while preserving Ethan's operational control through carefully structured voting rights. It was Aria realized almost exactly what she'd sketched in that conference room. The details had been refined, the legal language made bulletproof, but the core strategy remained. Give them what they want while protecting what you need. Teresa signed the partnership documents with a flourish, then looked directly at Aria for the first time. "You're wasted as just a translator," she said in English now, clear and direct. "If you ever want real power instead of borrowed influence, call me." She placed a business card on the table between them, then left with her team. The negotiations concluded successfully enough that everyone could claim victory. After they'd gone, Ethan picked up the business card, studied it, then handed it to Aria. "She's not wrong. You could build your own empire if you wanted." Aria looked at the card. Heavy stock, embossed lettering, the kind of professional credential that suggested serious money and serious connections. Then she set it down on the table, deliberately not pocketing it. I'm not interested in building an empire. I'm interested in surviving without drowning. She met Ethan's eyes. Is that going to be a problem? No. He smiled, genuine and warm. It's refreshing, actually. Most people I work with want more power constantly. You seem content with enough. Content is a strong word. I'm still figuring out what enough looks like. Aria stood ready to leave the restaurant that had been beautiful and expensive and faintly suffocating. But I know I don't want to end up like Marcus or James, so hungry for more that I destroy what I have. They rode back to the office in comfortable silence, the city sliding past the car windows in its endless sprawl of light and shadow. Aria was thinking about Teresa's offer, about the implied promise of independence and power, when Ethan spoke. I'm increasing your partnership stake in the company, not just salary, actual equity, 5% to start, with the potential for more based on performance. Aria turned to stare at him. That's worth millions, yes. Ethan's expression was serious. You've earned it. The Marcus situation saved me $7 million. The Manila partnership saved me from a hostile takeover that could have cost 10 times that. And your strategic insights have transformed how I think about risk management and partnership structures. I was just doing my job. You were doing significantly more than your job. And I compensate value, not just effort. He paused, then added more quietly. And I protect people who are loyal to me. Equity stake means you're not just an employee anymore. You're a partner with legal standing and financial security. If something happens to me, you're protected. The implications of that settled over Aria like a heavy coat. Are you expecting something to happen to you? I'm planning for contingencies. That's different. But his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd thought about this carefully, that the gala shooting and James's betrayal had made him recalculate his mortality in ways he hadn't before. Just say yes, Aria. Let me do this. Yes, she said quietly, and thank you.
Dasi santai disegar.
The equity paperwork was processed within a week, and suddenly Aria owned 5% of Evans and Cade. On paper, that made her worth more money than she'd ever imagined having. In practice, it meant she was now tied to the company's fate in ways that went beyond employment. She couldn't just walk away anymore without significant financial and legal complications. She'd traded mobility for security, independence for protection. It should have felt like a trap. Instead, it felt like finally having a foundation solid enough to build on. The dynamics in the office shifted subtly after that. People who'd been polite became deferential. Claire started including her in strategic planning meetings that had nothing to do with translation. And Richard, before he left, had looked at her with an expression that mixed resentment and grudging respect. You played it perfectly, he'd said during their final conversation. Came in looking helpless, revealed competence strategically, positioned yourself as indispensable. That's a skill set worth more than translation. I wasn't playing anything. I was surviving. Same thing, when you're good at it. Richard had picked up the box of his personal items from his office, then paused at the door. Advice. Since I won't be around to give it later, don't trust this too much. Ethan's loyal until you're more expensive than you're worth. Remember that. He'd left, and Aria had stood in his empty office wondering if he was right. Wondering if she was building something real or just constructing an elaborate house of cards that would collapse the moment she stopped being useful. 2 weeks after Richard's departure, Aria was working late when her office door opened without a knock. A man she didn't recognize stood there. Late 50s, expensive suit, the kind of face that suggested he smiled rarely and never without reason. Miss Bennett, I'm Jonathan Webb. He stepped inside without invitation, his movements controlled and deliberate. Marcus Webb's father. Aria's stomach dropped. She stood slowly, her mind racing through implications and threats. Mr. Webb, I'm sorry for your loss. My son isn't dead, just destroyed professionally. Jonathan's voice was cold, precise. By information you provided to Ethan Cade, information that cost Marcus everything he'd built. Your son was stealing from the company. I reported financial irregularities. You inserted yourself into a business relationship You didn't understand, made assumptions based on incomplete information, and convinced Ethan to destroy a partnership that had been profitable for years. Jonathan moved closer, and Aria fought the urge to step back. My son made mistakes, but he didn't deserve to be ruined completely. What do you want, Mr. Webb? I want you to understand that actions have consequences, that the information you provide, the strategies you suggest, they affect real people, destroy real lives. His eyes were cold, assessing. My son is working as a shift manager at a shipping warehouse now, making $30,000 a year doing manual labor because Ethan blacklisted him from every professional opportunity in the industry. You did that. The words hit harder than Aria expected. She'd known intellectually that Marcus had been destroyed, but she'd avoided thinking about the human cost, the specifics of how far he'd fallen, what his life looked like now. Your son stole $7 million, she said quietly. The consequences for that are his responsibility, not mine. He took calculated risks in a business built on calculated risks. The only difference between what he did and what Ethan does daily is that Ethan controls the narrative. Jonathan smiled, sharp and humorless. You're smart enough to see that, Ms. Bennett. Smart enough to know you're working for a man who ruins people when they stop being useful. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who's watched Ethan Cade operate for 20 years. Jonathan turned toward the door, then paused. My son thought he was protected because he was valuable, thought loyalty mattered. He learned otherwise. I hope you're smart enough to learn from his example before you need to learn from experience. Then he was gone, leaving Aria standing in her office with her hands shaking and her mind spinning with doubts she'd been carefully not thinking about. She left the building shortly after, taking the subway home instead of the car service she could now afford. The anonymity of public transit felt necessary, like she needed to remember what normal life looked like before she got too comfortable in the world of town cars and equity stakes. Her apartment, the nice one she'd moved to 3 months ago, 2 bedrooms, and actual sunlight, felt empty and too quiet. Aria made tea she didn't drink, sat on her couch staring at nothing, trying to process Jonathan Webb's warning and her own complicity. Had she destroyed Marcus Webb's life? Or had she just reported information that revealed destruction he'd caused himself? Was there a meaningful difference? Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Are you okay? Security said Jonathan Webb was in the building. He didn't threaten you, did he? Aria stared at the message, thinking about how Ethan had security reports on building visitors, how he tracked potential threats, how thoroughly he controlled the information environment around him. He wanted me to know what happened to Marcus, the details of how far he fell. The response came quickly. Marcus fell because of his own choices. You just provided information. That's what I told him. Not sure I believe it. A longer pause this time, then, can I come over? This conversation shouldn't happen over text. Aria hesitated, then typed, yes. Ethan arrived 30 minutes later, still in his work clothes, but with his tie loosened and his jacket discarded. He looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from stress rather than physical exertion. Talk to me, he said, settling onto her couch with the ease of someone who'd been there before. What did Jonathan actually say? Aria told him, recounting the conversation with the precision of her translator brain. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Marcus is working at a warehouse because I blacklisted him from professional opportunities, he said finally. Jonathan's right about that. I made calls, sent messages, ensured that Marcus Webb couldn't find work in any company connected to my network. Why? Because mercy in this business is interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites attack. Ethan's voice was matter-of-fact, not defensive. If I'd let Marcus transition gracefully to another company, it would have signaled that stealing from me had acceptable consequences. Other people would have calculated the risk differently. So you destroyed him to send a message. I destroyed him to protect what I'd built. The message was a byproduct. Ethan turned to look at her directly. Does that make you want to leave? To get out before you see more examples of how ruthless I can be? Aria thought about it, really thought about it. No, it makes me want to understand the rules better. To know what actions trigger what consequences, so I don't accidentally cross lines I don't see. The rules are simple. Loyalty is rewarded. Betrayal is destroyed. Competence is compensated. Incompetence that costs me money is eliminated. Ethan's voice was calm, stating facts rather than making threats. You've been loyal and competent, which is why you're thriving. Marcus was competent but disloyal, which is why he's not. And if I stop being competent, then you get additional training and support to improve. Incompetence is fixable. It's usually just a skills gap or a bad fit for the role. He smiled slightly. I don't destroy people for being human, Aria. I destroy them for betraying trust. There's a difference. It should have been terrifying, this calm discussion of destroying people's lives. Instead, it felt oddly reassuring, like Ethan was laying out the rules clearly so she could navigate successfully rather than leaving her to guess and stumble. Jonathan said you ruin people when they stop being useful, Aria said. Is that true? Jonathan's bitter because his son faced consequences. But to answer your question, no, I don't ruin people for stopping being useful. I ruin people who betray me while pretending loyalty. Ethan shifted closer to her on the couch. You could stop being useful tomorrow, decide translation isn't interesting anymore, want to try something else. And I'd help you transition to whatever you wanted to do next. But if you stole from me or sold information to competitors or used your position to harm what I've built, then yes, I'd destroy you completely. That's supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be honest. You asked for clarity about the rules. I'm giving it to you. His eyes were serious, intense. I care about you, Aria, more than I probably should, given that you work for me. But that doesn't mean I'll tolerate betrayal. It means I'll be devastated while I destroy you if it comes to that. The words should have sent her running. Instead, Aria found herself leaning closer, her hand finding his. I'm not going to betray you. I believe you. Right now. But Jonathan's warning isn't entirely wrong. You should be careful about trusting this too completely. I'm not a good man, Aria. I'm a pragmatic one who occasionally makes good choices because you make me want to. Then I'll keep making you want to, Aria said softly, and kissed him. It wasn't their first kiss. They'd been circling this attraction for weeks, giving into it in stolen moments that both of them pretended weren't happening. But this felt different, more deliberate. Not chemistry alone, but choice. Both of them stepping into something with open eyes and full knowledge of what it meant. When they finally broke apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. This is a terrible idea. You work for me. The power dynamic is completely unbalanced. We should maintain professional boundaries. Probably, Aria agreed. Are we going to? No. He kissed her again, deeper this time. But we're going to be careful about it. No displays at the office. No letting this affect business decisions. And if you ever want to stop, we stop. No consequences, no awkwardness, just professional reset. Negotiating the terms of a relationship. Very romantic. I negotiate everything. You knew this about me. But he was smiling, genuine and warm, and younger than she usually saw him. They spent the night talking more than anything else, about backgrounds and histories and the paths that had led them both to this moment. Ethan told her about growing up with nothing, building his first business while working 3 jobs, learning that the line between legitimate and illegitimate was often just a matter of paperwork and presentation. I never wanted to be a criminal, he said, lying beside her on the couch in the darkness of her living room. I wanted to be successful, and I learned early that success required operating in spaces where the rules were flexible. Gray areas have better profit margins than clearly legal spaces. Do you regret it? Sometimes, when I'm facing down people like Jonathan Webb whose lives I've damaged, when I calculate the cost of staying ahead of law enforcement and wonder if legitimate business would have been simpler. He was quiet for a moment. But then I remember that legitimate business wouldn't have given me the resources to build what I have. The influence, the wealth, the ability to shape outcomes. So I live with the regret and keep moving forward. Aria listened, understanding that this was Ethan without the professional mask, still calculating, still pragmatic, but honest about the costs of his choices. It made her feel less alone in her own moral ambiguity, less isolated in the compromise between ideals and survival. I used to think there were clear lines between right and wrong, she said, that good people did good things and bad people did bad things, and you knew which you were based on your choices. And now? Now I think there are mostly just people trying to survive, making whatever compromises let them sleep at night. She turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through her windows. I don't know if that makes us better or worse, just more honest about what we're willing to do. Ethan kissed her forehead, gentle and careful. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. He was right about that, though not in the way Aria expected. She woke to find him already gone. A note on her kitchen counter saying he had an early meeting and didn't want to wake her. Professional thoughtfulness, even in the context of something decidedly unprofessional. At the office, nothing had changed and everything had. They maintained careful distance, professional interactions, no hint of the night before. But Aria caught Ethan watching her during meetings with an expression that suggested he was thinking about things that had nothing to do with business strategy, and she had to work harder than usual to focus on translation instead of the memory of his hands in her hair. Claire noticed, of course. The assistant missed nothing, and her carefully neutral expression when she looked between Aria and Ethan suggested she'd already calculated the new dynamic and was deciding how to navigate it. Be careful, Claire said quietly, catching Aria alone in the break room. Office romances are complicated under normal circumstances. Office romances when one person owns the company and the other is rapidly becoming his most trusted strategist? That's potentially explosive. I know, Aria said. We're being careful. Are you, or are you just being discreet? Claire's voice wasn't unkind, just experienced. Because there's a difference. Careful means having exit strategies and clear boundaries. Discreet just means hiding it well. We've talked about boundaries. Ethan's boundaries shift when emotions get involved. I've worked for him for 8 years. I've seen how he operates when he cares about someone. Claire set down her coffee, her expression serious. He's loyal to the point of destruction, which sounds romantic until you realize it means he'll destroy things to protect what he's loyal to, including, potentially, you if he thinks it's for your own good. Aria wanted to argue, to defend Ethan and their carefully negotiated understanding, but Claire's warning echoed Jonathan Webb's, and the pattern was hard to ignore. What do you think I should do? I think you should decide what you actually want, a career, a relationship, or both, and be honest with yourself about whether you can have all of it with Ethan Cade. Claire picked up her coffee again. And I think you should have a lawyer review your equity agreement. Make sure you understand exactly what happens if the personal relationship fails and you want to leave the professional one. It was good advice, practical, and clear-eyed. Aria spent the rest of the day thinking about it, working through translation projects while her mind ran calculations about risk and reward, sustainability, and self-protection. That evening, she met with a lawyer, not one of Ethan's, but an independent attorney recommended by a former Columbia classmate. She brought her equity agreement, her employment contract, all the paperwork that defined her relationship with Evans and Cade. The lawyer, a sharp woman in her 40s named Diana Chen, read through everything with the kind of focus that suggested she saw implications Aria had missed. This is actually better than I expected, Diana said finally. The equity agreement has a buyout clause that's quite favorable to you if you choose to leave. And the employment contract doesn't have a non-compete that would prevent you from working in the field elsewhere. So I could walk away? With significant financial compensation for your equity stake, full rights to use your professional reputation, and no legal barriers to working for competitors. Diana set down the papers. Whoever drafted this either didn't think you'd leave or wanted to make sure you could if you needed to. That's unusual in these kinds of arrangements. Aria thought about Ethan telling her she could leave if the personal relationship failed, promising no consequences beyond normal business separation. She thought it was just words. The kind of thing people said to make boundaries sound clearer than they were. Apparently he'd meant it legally as well as personally. One concern, Diana continued, this agreement was drafted before your role expanded significantly. You're now doing strategic work that's probably worth more than standard translation services. You might want to renegotiate to reflect your current value. Or I might want to keep the favorable exit terms, Aria said slowly, understanding the trade-off. Higher compensation might come with tighter restrictions. Exactly. So you need to decide, are you planning to stay long-term, in which case higher compensation makes sense? Or are you protecting your ability to leave, in which case the current agreement is actually optimal? Aria didn't have an answer to that question. She thanked Diana, paid her consultation fee, and left with her paperwork and more questions than she'd arrived with. That night, she sat in her apartment going through files she'd accumulated over 6 months. Translation work, strategic analyses, meeting notes. She'd built something real here, carved out a role that used her skills and challenged her mind. The money was better than anything she'd dreamed of. The work was interesting, and Ethan valued her in ways that felt genuine. But Jonathan Webb's warning and Claire's concern and Diana's careful legal analysis all pointed to the same question. What happened when the personal relationship inevitably complicated the professional one? When emotions and business interests diverged? When loyalty and self-preservation pulled in different directions? Her phone buzzed. Ethan, dinner tomorrow? My place. I'll cook. Aria stared at the message, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Then she typed back, yes, but we need to talk about some things. Always. 7 p.m.? Perfect. She arrived at Ethan's penthouse the next evening with her lawyer's analysis in her bag and her resolve somewhat steadier. He greeted her with wine and a smile, looking more relaxed than she usually saw him. Jeans instead of a suit, barefoot, actually cooking instead of ordering in. You look nervous, he observed, handing her a glass. I talked to a lawyer yesterday about my equity agreement and employment contract. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, attention sharpening, the businessman calculating implications. Smart. What did they say? That you built in very favorable exit terms, that I could walk away with full compensation and no restrictions. Aria set down her wine glass. Why did you do that? Most people in your position would have locked me in tighter. Because I don't want you here if you don't want to be here, Ethan said simply. Locked-in employees become resentful. Resentful employees make mistakes or become security risks. Better to make it easy to leave and trust that you'll stay, because you want to. That's very trusting for someone who destroys people for betrayal. There's a difference between leaving and betraying. I only destroy the latter. He moved closer, his hand finding her waist. Are you planning to leave? I don't know. I'm trying to figure out if I can have both things I want, the career and the relationship, or if choosing one means sacrificing the other. And what did you conclude? That I need more information before I can decide. Aria looked up at him. I need to understand what you actually want from this, from us. Beyond the physical attraction and the professional respect, what are we building here? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. Then he took her hand, led her to the balcony overlooking the city, the place where they'd stood together before and watched lights sparkle in the darkness. I want partnership, he said finally. Not just in business, but in life. Someone who understands what I do without judging it, who challenges me to be better without demanding I pretend to be someone I'm not. He turned to face her fully. I've built an empire, Aria. It's profitable and powerful and completely hollow. You're the first person in years who's made me think there might be something worth building beyond profit and power. That's a lot of pressure to put on a relationship that's barely started. I know, which is why I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I'm just being honest about what I'm hoping for, that this could become something real, something sustainable, something worth more than either of us could build alone. Aria thought about her tiny apartment 2 years ago, about cleaning offices at 4 a.m, about the desperate woman who'd taken a dangerous job because drowning slowly was still drowning. She thought about how far she'd come and how much of that journey had been shaped by the man standing beside her. I want that too, she said quietly. But I need boundaries, clear ones that we both respect even when emotions make it difficult. Name them. First, work and personal stay separate. We don't let relationship conflicts affect business decisions, and we don't use business leverage in personal arguments. Agreed. Second, if either of us wants to end the relationship, we can do it cleanly without destroying the professional partnership. No retaliation, no making the workplace toxic. Also agreed, though I'd argue that's already covered in your employment contract. Third, Aria hesitated, then pushed forward. If you ever start operating in areas I can't ethically support, I get to walk away without consequences. You said I get one refusal, but I need to know that applies to the whole operation, not just individual projects. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded. That's fair. Though I'd ask that before you walk away, you talk to me about what's crossing your line. Give me a chance to course correct instead of just leaving. I can do that. Aria took a breath. And fourth, complete honesty about what the business actually does. No more gray areas where I'm guessing whether something's legal or just legally defensible. I need to know what I'm part of. That's the hardest one, Ethan said slowly. Not because I want to lie to you, but because complete honesty means exposing operations that could be used against us if information leaked. Then we established that I'm bound by the same confidentiality as your lawyers. Attorney-client privilege level protection. That's not actually how it works. Then make it how it works. Have your lawyers draft an agreement that gives me legal protection for information shared in confidence, whatever it takes to make complete honesty possible without creating security risks. Ethan studied her face, his expression thoughtful. Then he smiled, slow and genuine. You're negotiating like a partner already. I learned from the best. He kissed her then, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They moved from the balcony to his bedroom with the kind of urgency that came from weeks of careful distance finally breaking down. And when they finally lay together in the darkness, Aria felt something shift. Not completion exactly, but rightness, like pieces fitting together in a way that made sense, despite all the reasons it shouldn't. I'll have the lawyers draft the confidentiality agreement, Ethan said quietly, his hand tracing patterns on her shoulder. And tomorrow, I'll start giving you complete transparency about operations. All of it, not just what you need to know for your specific projects. Are you sure? That's a lot of trust. You've earned it, and honestly, having someone I can talk to completely honestly about the business, that's worth the risk. He kissed her forehead. Besides, if you're going to be my partner in building something better, you need to understand exactly what we're building from. Aria fell asleep that night feeling like she'd crossed another threshold, stepped deeper into Ethan's world with eyes open and terms negotiated. It should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first time in years that she was building something that might actually last. The next morning, Ethan made good on his promise. Over coffee in his kitchen, he opened his laptop and walked her through the complete structure of Evans and Cade's operations, the legitimate consulting work, the gray area logistics, the customs relationships that skirted legal boundaries, the financial structures designed to minimize tax exposure while staying defensible in court. It was, as he'd warned, uglier than the sanitized version she'd been working with. Not violently criminal, but aggressive in ways that pushed every boundary and exploited every loophole. The kind of operation that would survive legal scrutiny but wouldn't survive public exposure intact. This is what I built, Ethan said, his voice matter of fact. It's profitable, it's powerful, and it's completely dependent on operating in spaces where most people won't look too closely. And if someone does look closely, then we have lawyers who are very good at making operations look more legitimate than they are, and financial structures complex enough that proving wrongdoing would take years. He closed the laptop. It's not sustainable long term. Eventually, someone will look closely enough, or regulations will close the loopholes we operate in, which is why I've been thinking about transition strategies. Aria set down her coffee, suddenly very alert. What kind of transition strategies? Moving into genuinely legitimate operations. Not gray area legal, but clearly, defensibly legal. It would mean lower profit margins, losing partnerships that can't transition, probably significant restructuring costs. Ethan looked at her carefully. But it would also mean building something that could last decades instead of years. Something I could be proud of instead of just protective of. You've been thinking about this before I came along. I've been thinking about it since the first federal investigation 3 years ago. But I didn't have a compelling reason to actually do it until you showed me what we could build instead. His hand found hers across the table. So here's my question. If I commit to transitioning to completely legitimate operations, will you commit to building that with me? As a full partner with equity stake that reflects your strategic role, helping reshape this entire operation. It was everything Aria had been negotiating toward without fully admitting it. The chance to be part of something meaningful, to use her skills building instead of just facilitating, to transform the compromises she'd made into something worth the cost. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Yes, I'll build it with you. Ethan's smile was brilliant, relieved, genuinely happy. Then let's get started, because this is going to take years, and I'd rather spend those years with you than alone. They spent the rest of the morning sketching out transition plans, identifying which operations could shift to legitimate frameworks and which would need to be phased out entirely. It was the kind of strategic planning Aria had come to love. Complex, intellectually challenging, requiring her to see patterns and navigate cultural frameworks. But more than that, it felt like building something real. Not just surviving, not just climbing out of the hole she'd fallen into, but actually constructing a future worth having. As they worked, Aria caught herself thinking about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, invisible, desperate, convinced her life had peaked and was now just decline. That woman wouldn't recognize this life, wouldn't believe it was possible to go from cleaning offices at dawn to strategizing multi-million-dollar business transitions over coffee, with a man who valued her mind as much as her labor. The journey had been dark, dangerous, full of compromises. But somehow, impossibly, it had led here, to partnership and possibility and the chance to build something better than survival. Aria looked at Ethan, bent over his laptop and scribbling notes about regulatory frameworks, and felt something dangerous and wonderful bloom in her chest. Not just attraction or professional respect, but something deeper. The recognition that they were building this together, that their futures had become genuinely intertwined. It should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home to a place she hadn't known she was looking for. The gunshot shattered the crystal chandelier 3 feet above Aria's head, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, she watched 1,000 pieces of light explode into darkness. Then Ethan's hand was on her arm, pulling her down behind the bar with enough force that her shoulder hit the mahogany edge hard enough to bruise. "Stay down," he said, his voice deadly calm even as chaos erupted around them. The gala had been beautiful 30 seconds ago. The ballroom of the Saint. Regis was filled with the city's elite, champagne flowing, a string quartet playing something elegant and forgettable. Aria had been standing near the bar in a dress Ethan had insisted she buy for the occasion, black silk that cost more than her first month's rent had been, feeling out of place among women dripping in diamonds and men whose watches could fund a college education. She'd been watching Ethan work the room with the easy confidence of someone who belonged everywhere, thinking about how much had changed in 5 months, thinking about the manila envelope in her clutch that contained evidence she'd spent the past week gathering, evidence that pointed to a traitor inside Ethan's inner circle. She'd been about to show it to him when the first shot rang out. Now she was pressed against the floor behind the bar, her evening clutch somehow still gripped in her hand, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Around them, screams and breaking glass, the sound of people running, of expensive shoes on marble floors. Another gunshot, closer this time. The mirror behind the bar exploded, raining glass down on them. Ethan covered her body with his, one hand protecting her head, the other reaching inside his jacket for something she realized with cold clarity was a gun. "How many?" His voice was directed at someone else, and Aria turned her head enough to see Richard crouched beside them, his own weapon drawn, his face pale but controlled. "At least 3, maybe more. They came in through the service entrance." Richard's voice was tight. "This was planned. They knew the layout, knew the security protocols." "Inside job," Ethan said flatly. Then to Aria, "Can you run?" "What? Can you run in those heels?" Aria's brain was screaming at her to panic, but some survival instinct kicked in instead, the same instinct that had carried her across an ocean, that had kept her alive through poverty and grief. "Yes." "Good. When I say go, you run for the kitchen exit. Don't stop, don't look back. Richard will be right behind you." "What about you?" "I'm going to make sure you get out." Ethan's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she'd never seen before. Fear, sharp and real, but not for himself. "Do you trust me?" It was an insane question to ask while people were shooting at them, but Aria found herself nodding. "Yes." "Then go. Now." He moved, drawing fire with him, and Aria ran. Her heels clicked against marble, her breath coming in gasps, the clutch still somehow in her hand. Richard was beside her, then ahead of her, clearing the path. They burst through the kitchen doors into organized chaos. Staff hiding behind industrial refrigerators, security personnel shouting into radios. Richard grabbed her arm, pulled her toward a service corridor. "This way, there's a car waiting in the loading dock." They ran through passages that smelled like expensive food and industrial cleaner, past startled kitchen workers and terrified waitstaff. Aria's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. Behind them, more gunshots, shouting, the sounds of violence that her brain refused to fully process. The loading dock was cold, the night air hitting her like a slap after the overheated ballroom. A black SUV was idling with its door open, and Richard practically threw her into the back seat. "Drive," he barked at whoever was behind the wheel. Then to Aria, "Stay down. Don't move until I tell you." The vehicle lurched forward, tires squealing on concrete. Aria huddled on the floor between seats, her silk dress twisted around her legs, her mind finally catching up to what had just happened. Someone had just tried to kill them. Not rob them, not threaten them, kill them. The kind of violence that left bodies on marble floors and made the news for weeks. And Ethan was still back there. "We have to go back," she said, her voice coming out strangled. "Ethan's still—" "He can handle himself." Richard's tone was grim. "Right now my job is getting you somewhere safe." "Why me? I'm just a translator." "You're not just anything anymore." Richard was on his phone, speaking in clipped sentences to someone. "You've been sitting in strategy meetings for 3 months. You know routes, contacts, financial structures. If someone wanted to hurt Ethan's operation, taking you would be a smart move." The SUV took a corner hard enough that Aria had to brace herself against the seat. She could hear sirens now, police or ambulance or both, the sounds of a city responding to violence. "Where are we going?" "Safe house in Brooklyn. You'll stay there until we know the situation is contained." "What about my apartment, my things?" "Already being secured. Everything you need will be at the safe house." Richard finally looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I know this is terrifying, but you're alive and we're going to keep you that way." Aria wanted to ask more questions, wanted to demand answers, wanted to know if Ethan was okay. But her voice had stopped working properly, shock settling into her bones like ice. The safe house turned out to be a brownstone in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, the kind of place that looked absolutely normal from the outside. Inside, it was clearly set up for exactly this purpose. Reinforced doors, security cameras, no windows on the ground floor. Richard led her to a bedroom that was surprisingly comfortable, gestured to a closet. "There's clothes in there, various sizes. Bathroom is through that door. Don't leave this room until I come get you." "How long?" "I don't know. Could be hours, could be days." He paused at the door. "Ms. Bennett, Aria, you did well tonight, staying calm under fire, following instructions. Most people freeze." "I didn't feel calm." "You don't have to feel it to be it." Then he was gone, the door closing with a solid click that might have been a lock. Aria stood in the middle of the bedroom, still holding her clutch, still wearing the silk dress that now had a tear along one seam. Her hands started shaking, then her whole body, the adrenaline finally crashing. She made it to the bathroom before she threw up, her stomach rejecting the expensive canapes she'd eaten at the gala. When there was nothing left, she sat on the cold tile floor and let herself cry. Silent, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and primitive. The place that understood how close she'd come to dying. Eventually, the tears stopped. Aria stood, washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was smeared makeup and tangled hair and eyes that had seen too much. She looked like a stranger. She changed into clothes from the closet, jeans and a sweater that were slightly too big but clean and comfortable. Put her phone on the nightstand, though she didn't know who she'd call even if it worked. Sat on the bed and finally opened her clutch. The manila envelope was still there, slightly bent but intact. Inside were the documents she'd been planning to show Ethan, printouts of financial transfers, email exchanges, evidence that she'd spent a week carefully gathering, evidence that pointed to James as the traitor. It had taken her 3 weeks to see the pattern. Small discrepancies in financial routing that looked like errors but formed a consistent direction. Communications that went through channels they shouldn't have. References to alternative partnerships buried in footnotes of meeting minutes that no one read carefully. James had been more careful than Marcus, but not careful enough, and he'd made the mistake of underestimating the translator who sat quietly in meetings and saw everything. Aria had planned to tell Ethan tonight, away from the office, somewhere private. But then the shooting started, and now she was locked in a safe house while people tried to kill the man she... She stopped that thought before it could finish. Couldn't afford to examine what Ethan had become to her, how somewhere between professional respect and personal trust, the lines had blurred into something dangerous. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Secure. You? Aria's hands shook as she typed back, Safe House, Brooklyn. Are you hurt? The response came immediately. Minor. Nothing serious? Stay where you are. Richard has orders. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but settled for, what happened? Later. Rest. You're safe now. Aria stared at the phone, then typed, I have information you need. About tonight. A longer pause this time. Then, tomorrow, face to face. Sleep, Aria. She set the phone down, lay back on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion was stronger than fear, and eventually she drifted off with her clothes still on and the manila envelope clutched against her chest. She woke to voices downstairs, Richard's, and another she recognized even before she heard the words clearly. Ethan. Aria was out of bed and halfway down the stairs before she remembered she was supposed to stay in the room. She found them in what looked like a living room, Richard standing while Ethan sat on a couch, his jacket discarded, his white shirt torn and stained with what might have been blood. You're supposed to be resting, Richard said when he saw her, but his tone lacked real criticism. Ethan looked up and his expression shifted. Relief, sharp and immediate. You're okay. I'm fine. You're bleeding. Aria crossed to him, her eyes cataloging the damage. A cut above his left eyebrow, bruising along his jaw, his right hand wrapped in what looked like a makeshift bandage. Superficial. I've had worse. But he didn't pull away when she sat beside him, didn't protest when she gently turned his head to examine the cut on his forehead. This needs stitches. It needs to be ignored until we deal with more important problems. Ethan's voice was tired, the controls slipping enough that she could hear the strain underneath. Tell me about the information you mentioned. Aria retrieved the manila envelope from upstairs, returned to find Richard had poured 3 glasses of whiskey. She took one, grateful, then spread the documents across the coffee table. James, she said simply, he's been running a parallel operation for at least 2 months, using your infrastructure to facilitate his own deals, skimming profits, and, based on tonight, trying to remove you entirely so he can take over. Ethan's expression went cold, dangerous. He picked up one of the documents, scanned it, his jaw tightening. How certain are you? Completely. The evidence is circumstantial individually, but together it forms a clear pattern. And tonight wasn't random. This was coordinated, professional. Someone gave the shooters your schedule, the venue layout, security protocols. Aria pointed to a specific email exchange. This communication from 3 days ago references finalizing the transition and mentions the gala specifically. Richard was reading over Ethan's shoulder, his expression grim. The timing checks out. James insisted on handling security arrangements for tonight, said he wanted to ensure everything was perfect. He ensured we'd be vulnerable. Ethan set down the document, his control reasserting itself, but his eyes still cold. Where is he now? Missing. Left the gala before the shooting started. We have people looking, but he's running. Ethan stood, started pacing despite the obvious pain it caused. He knows the attack failed, knows we'll be looking at who benefited. He's either running or preparing for a second attempt. We should go to the police, Aria said. This is attempted murder. The police can't help us. Ethan's voice was flat. This isn't their jurisdiction. This is corporate warfare dressed up in bullets. And if we involve law enforcement, we expose operations that can't survive that kind of scrutiny. So what do? We find James before he finds us. We secure our operations, identify anyone working with him, and we shut this down permanently. Ethan turned to Richard. I want a full audit of everyone with access to sensitive information. Financial records, communications, everything. Anyone who's had contact with James in the past 3 months gets investigated. That's going to create panic among the staff. Better panic than a bullet. Ethan's tone allowed no argument. And pull security footage from the office building for the past month. If James has been coordinating with outsiders, there will be evidence. Richard nodded and stepped away to make calls, leaving Aria alone with Ethan. He'd stopped pacing, standing by the window looking out at the quiet Brooklyn street with his shoulders tense. You should have told me about James earlier, he said quietly. I was going to, tonight. I wanted to be absolutely certain before I accused one of your senior partners of treason. If you told me yesterday, maybe I could have prevented this. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. Maybe those people in the ballroom wouldn't be traumatized. Maybe the bartender wouldn't be in the hospital with a gunshot wound. Aria stood, cross to him. You can't blame yourself for what James chose to do. I can blame myself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting the wrong person. He finally turned to look at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was profound. I put you in danger because I was blind. You didn't put me anywhere. I chose this. She reached out, touched his hand, the uninjured one. I chose to stay, to go deeper, to become whatever I've become. That's on me, not you. Ethan looked down at her hand on his expression complicated. You shouldn't have had to make that choice. Maybe not, but I did. And here we are. Aria didn't pull her hand away. What happens now? Now we survive, we adapt. We make sure James pays for what he's done, and we rebuild stronger. His fingers tightened around hers slightly. And I make sure you're protected, whatever it takes. The possessiveness was back in his voice, but this time it felt different, less about property and more about something deeper, something that made Aria's breath catch. Ethan, you should rest more. It's almost dawn, and today is going to be difficult. He released her hand, stepped back, the professional mask sliding back into place. Richard will take you back to the safe house. You'll stay there until we've secured the situation. How long will that take? However long it takes. His voice was firm. You don't leave that house unless I personally come to get you. No exceptions. Understood? Aria wanted to argue, wanted to demand a role in what came next, but the look in Ethan's eyes told her this wasn't negotiable. This was him drawing a line, keeping her safe the only way he knew how. Understood, she said quietly. The next 3 days were among the longest of Aria's life. She stayed in the Brooklyn safe house, reading the books that lined the shelves, watching mindless television, trying not to climb the walls from boredom and anxiety. Richard checked in twice a day with updates that were simultaneously too much information and not enough. James was still missing. The investigation into his network was ongoing. 2 junior staff members had been fired for having undisclosed contacts with James's associates. The gala shooting was being reported in the news as a random attack, gang violence spilling into the wrong venue, a story that Ethan's lawyers had apparently helped craft to keep the real story buried. And Ethan himself didn't visit, didn't call, sent only brief texts that confirmed he was alive but revealed nothing else. On the 4th day, Aria was making coffee in the safe house kitchen when she heard the front door open. She grabbed the closest weapon, a chef's knife from the block, and was halfway to the living room when Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked worse than he had 4 days ago. The bruising on his face had deepened to purple and yellow. The cut above his eyebrow had been stitched but still looked angry, and the shadows under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. But he was alive, upright, and looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You can put the knife down, he said, the corner of his mouth quirking up slightly. Unless you're planning to stab me for taking so long. Aria set the knife on the counter, her heart still racing. What happened? We found James, or rather, he found us. Ethan moved into the kitchen, poured himself coffee like he owned the place, which, she supposed, he probably did. He tried to execute a hostile takeover of our Manila operations, using the chaos from the gala to move while we were supposedly vulnerable. What did you do? Took back what was mine. With interest. His voice was cold, matter-of-fact. James is no longer a problem. Neither are his associates. The operation is secure. Aria studied his face, looking for details in what he wasn't saying. Did you kill him? Ethan took a long sip of coffee before answering. I destroyed him. Financially, professionally, personally. Death would have been quicker, but less permanent. This way, he lives with what he lost. It should have terrified her, the casual ruthlessness in his voice. Instead, Aria felt something closer to relief, that Ethan was capable of protecting what was his, that he'd survived when people were trying to kill him. Are we safe now? She asked. As safe as we ever are in this business. He set down his coffee, moved closer to her. But I need to know something, Aria, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay? Why did you figure out it was James? Most people would have missed it, would have accepted the surface explanation. Why did you dig deeper? Aria thought about it, about the late nights reviewing documents, the pattern recognition that was part translation training and part survival instinct. Because I was watching for betrayal. After Marcus, after seeing how close you came to being destroyed by someone you trusted, I started looking for it everywhere. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was just careful, but I couldn't stop seeing patterns that didn't quite fit. You were protecting me. His voice was quiet, almost wondering. I was protecting myself. If you went down, I went down with you. That's not the whole truth. Ethan was very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the precise line of the scar above his eyebrow. You could have walked away at any point. Could have taken my recommendation, found legitimate work, disappeared, but you stayed. I had debts. Debts you paid off 2 months ago. I know because I track employee financial situations. You're solvent, Aria. Have been for weeks. So why are you still here? The question hung between them, dangerous and unavoidable. Aria could lie, could fall back on professional excuses. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending she didn't feel the pull between them that had been building for months. Because I choose you, she said simply. Not the job, not the money. You. Ethan's expression shifted. Surprise, heat, something that might have been relief. That's a dangerous choice. I've made worse. He laughed, a real sound, then closed the distance between them. His kiss was urgent, desperate, tasting like coffee and exhaustion, and something that felt terrifyingly like need. Aria kissed him back, her hands finding his shoulders, careful of his injuries but not gentle. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. This complicates things. Everything about us is already complicated. Fair point. He pulled back slightly, his hand still on her waist. I'm bringing you back to the city. To my apartment, not the safe house. You'll stay there until we're absolutely certain the threat is contained. Is that professional concern or personal? Both. Does it matter? Aria thought about it, about how thoroughly she'd crossed every line she'd promised herself she wouldn't cross. No, I suppose it doesn't. They left the Brooklyn safe house an hour later, Ethan's driver taking them through the city as it woke up to another morning. Aria watched the familiar streets scroll past, thinking about how much had changed since she'd first cleaned these buildings in the darkness before dawn. Ethan's apartment was in Tribeca, a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a building whose lobby had actual art installations. It was beautiful in a way only serious money could buy, floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Make yourself at home, Ethan said, dropping his keys on a table by the door. I have calls to make, damage control to coordinate. There's food in the kitchen, anything you need. He disappeared into what looked like a home office, and Aria was left standing in the middle of luxury she'd only ever seen in movies. She explored carefully, finding a guest bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment, a bathroom with a tub deep enough to swim in, a wine collection that probably cost more than her college degree. She ended up on the balcony, looking out at the city spread below like a glittering promise. Somewhere down there was her old life, the tiny apartment, the cleaning job she'd quit, the version of herself who'd been invisible and desperate. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone Aria had been in a different lifetime. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother, the first in weeks. Are you okay? I saw news about shooting at Fancy Hotel. Not you, right? Aria typed back. I'm fine, nothing to worry about. How are you feeling? The response came quickly. Good. Medicine working, doctor happy. You sound different. Something change? Everything, Aria thought. Everything changed. Just work stuff, she typed. I'll call you this weekend. Love you. She put the phone away before her mother could ask more questions she couldn't answer. Inside, she could hear Ethan's voice, sharp and commanding, handling whatever crisis needed handling. The man who'd kissed her like she was oxygen, who told her she was his to protect, who operated in shadows and gray areas and justified it all with ruthless pragmatism. Aria should have been terrified, Should have been planning her escape, finding a way out before she got in too deep. Instead, she turned back to face the apartment, the luxury and danger and complicated man who came with it, and accepted what she'd known for weeks but hadn't admitted. She wasn't going anywhere. For better or worse, she'd chosen this, chosen him, and now she'd have to live with whatever came next. Ethan emerged from his office an hour later, looking marginally less exhausted. Hungry? Starving. They ordered food from a place that didn't have prices on the menu, ate at his dining table that seated 12, talked about nothing important, movies they'd seen, books they'd read, the kind of normal conversation that felt surreal given everything else. After dinner, Ethan poured wine, led her back to the balcony. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that softened the city's hard edges. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious, "about what comes next." Aria's stomach tightened. "Okay." The gala attack, James's betrayal, it exposed vulnerabilities in how I've been running operations. I'm restructuring everything. Tighter security, fewer people with access to sensitive information, more verification protocols. That makes sense. It means your role will change. You won't just be translating anymore. You'll be part of my inner circle, helping make strategic decisions, identifying threats before they become crises. He turned to look at her. It's more responsibility, more risk, and more money. But it also means you can't walk away easily. Once you're that deep, leaving becomes complicated. How complicated? The kind where I'd need to be absolutely certain you weren't taking information to competitors, where leaving would require negotiations, agreements, probably a significant payout to ensure your silence. His voice was calm, factual. I'm not trying to trap you, but I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. Aria thought about the life she'd built from desperation and compromise, about the man standing beside her who'd given her back her dignity and taken pieces of her soul in exchange. "I want one thing," she said finally. "Name it. Honesty. No more gray areas about what we do, what you ask me to be part of. I need to know the limits, the lines we won't cross, what I'm actually involved in. Can you give me that?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read in the fading light. Then he nodded. "Yes, I can give you that. It won't always be comfortable, and sometimes the truth will be uglier than you want to hear, but I'll be honest." "Then I'm in." Aria held out her hand, formal, sealing it like a contract. "Whatever comes next, I'm in." Ethan took her hand, pulled her close instead of shaking it, kissed her with the kind of intensity that made her forget about everything except the feel of his hands on her waist, his mouth on hers, the dangerous territory they were walking into together. When they finally broke apart, the city lights had come on below them, a million points of brightness in the darkness. "Welcome to the inner circle, Aria Bennett," Ethan said softly. "Try not to get us both killed." Aria laughed despite everything, despite the danger and the moral compromise and the certain knowledge that she'd just agreed to something that would change her forever. "I'll do my best," she said, and meant it. The restructuring took 3 months, and Aria watched Ethan transform his empire with the same ruthless precision he applied to everything else. Partners who couldn't be completely trusted were bought out. Security protocols were overhauled. Financial structures were reorganized to make theft nearly impossible. And through it all, Aria sat in meetings that used to terrify her, offering insights that shaped decisions worth millions. She'd stopped being surprised when Ethan asked her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with translation. Stopped second-guessing herself when her pattern recognition caught things others missed. Somewhere along the way, she'd become exactly what he'd promised, part of his inner circle, trusted with secrets that could destroy them both. But the change that mattered most was the one happening to Ethan himself. It started small. A shipping deal in Southeast Asia that would have been profitable, but involved partners with documented human rights violations. The old Ethan would have justified it. Business was business, and morality was expensive. But Aria had looked at him across the conference table and said quietly, "We can do better than this." And he'd walked away from $7 million without blinking. Then there was the customs official in Singapore who'd been on Ethan's payroll for years, facilitating shipments through regulatory gray areas. When Aria discovered the man was also taking bribes from a trafficking network, she'd brought it to Ethan expecting a pragmatic calculation of risk versus reward. Instead, Ethan had cut ties immediately, reported the official through channels that wouldn't expose Evans and Cade's involvement, and spent 2 weeks restructuring their Singapore operations to work within actual legal frameworks. "It'll cost us," Richard had warned. "Compliance isn't cheap." "Neither is being complicit in trafficking," Ethan had replied, his voice flat and final. "Find another way." Aria had watched these changes accumulate, watched Ethan draw lines she'd never expected him to draw, and realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. He was changing because of her, not performing for her, not trying to impress her, but genuinely reconsidering the compromises he'd made in building his empire. 6 months after the gala shooting, Aria woke up in Ethan's bed. A regular occurrence now, though they'd been careful to keep their relationship private from the office, to find him already awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression he got when he was working through a complicated problem. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "I've been thinking about legitimacy." He turned to look at her, his hand finding hers under the sheets. Real legitimacy, not just cleaner gray areas, completely restructuring the business to operate within legal frameworks. Aria propped herself up on one elbow, suddenly very awake. "That's a massive undertaking." "I know. It would take years. We'd have to phase out partnerships that can't transition to legitimate operations, accept lower profit margins, probably lose some people who prefer the gray area work." His eyes were serious, searching her face. "But I think it's possible, and I think it's necessary." "Why now?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Because I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of operating in spaces where the rules are negotiable and loyalty is purchased. Tired of wondering when the next James will appear, or when law enforcement will decide our gray areas are actually crimes." He paused, then continued more softly. "And because you made me see that there's a difference between surviving and building something worth keeping. I've spent 10 years surviving, Aria. I want to try building instead." The vulnerability in his voice made her chest ache. This was the Ethan few people saw, not the controlled businessman or the dangerous operator, but the man who'd clawed his way up from nothing and was tired of the cost. "It won't be easy," Aria said carefully. "Some of your partners won't transition. Some deals will have to be abandoned. You'll face resistance from people who've gotten comfortable with how things work." "I know. That's why I need to know if you'll help me do it." His eyes held hers, not as an employee, as a partner. Someone with equity stake and decision-making power. Someone building this with me, not just working for me. Aria's breath caught. "Ethan, I'm serious. I want to restructure Evans and Cade into a legitimate international consulting and logistics firm. I want you as chief strategy officer, with a full partnership stake. I want to build something we can be proud of instead of something we have to hide." He shifted to face her fully. "But I need to know if that's something you want too, or if I'm asking you to invest in a future you don't actually want." Aria thought about the past 6 months, about how thoroughly her life had changed. She thought about the woman she'd been, desperate, invisible, drowning, and the woman she'd become, not perfect, not innocent, but stronger, clearer, more herself than she'd been in years. "I want it," she said quietly. "But I need you to promise me something. Anything. If we do this, if we really commit to going legitimate, we do it completely. No half measures, no keeping one foot in the gray areas just in case. We either build something clean, or we don't build it at all." Ethan's smile was slow, genuine, the kind that transformed his entire face. "Deal. Though I should warn you, legitimate business is probably boring. After the past 6 months, boring sounds perfect." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and for a moment the future could wait. But eventually they got up, made coffee, started the complicated work of dismantling an empire built on shadows and rebuilding it in daylight. The transition took 18 months and tested every skill Aria had developed. She spent weeks analyzing partnerships, identifying which could transition to legitimate operations and which had to be severed. She negotiated exits with associates who'd built careers in gray areas, offering severance packages and references for those willing to walk away peacefully. Some did, others fought. Richard was one of the fighters. He'd sat across from Ethan in the conference room, his expression carefully controlled, and said, You're destroying everything we built. For what? To make yourself feel better? To build something sustainable, Ethan had replied calmly. The gray area operations had an expiration date, Richard. Either we got caught eventually, or we spent our lives looking over our shoulders. This way, we choose the timeline instead of waiting for it to choose us. And if I don't want to transition, then you leave with a generous severance package and my gratitude for years of excellent work. But you leave. Richard had looked at Aria then, his expression accusing. This is your influence. You convinced him to throw away a profitable operation because of your moral qualms. No, Aria had said quietly. I showed him there were other options. The choice to take them was entirely his. Richard had left that afternoon, taking 3 other senior associates with him. It hurt. These were people who'd stood beside them during the gala shooting, who'd helped rebuild after James's betrayal. But they couldn't or wouldn't make the leap to legitimacy, and Ethan had learned the hard way that you couldn't build a new foundation on people committed to the old one. The restructuring also meant making restitution for past operations that had caused harm. When Aria discovered that one of their former shipping partners had been using Evans and Cade routes to move counterfeit pharmaceuticals, she'd spent 3 weeks tracing the distribution network and quietly ensuring that affected healthcare systems received authentic replacements. This is costing us a fortune, Claire had observed, no longer just an assistant, but the chief operating officer, helping coordinate the transition. Money will never recover. Consider it the cost of buying back our integrity, Ethan had said. Some debts can't be negotiated away. Slowly, painfully, the business transformed. Partnerships with legitimate international corporations replaced gray area deals. Consulting contracts based on actual expertise replaced facilitation fees for regulatory navigation. The profit margins were smaller, but the operations were defensible, transparent, built to last. And through it all, Aria discovered that legitimate business used her skills just as thoroughly as the shadow operations had, just differently. Instead of identifying deception, she built communication frameworks. Instead of finding loopholes, she negotiated genuine partnerships. Instead of keeping secrets, she created transparency. It was harder than she'd expected, and more satisfying. 15 months into the transition, Aria was reviewing contracts in her office when Claire appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested either very good news or very bad. There's someone here to see you. Says he's from the Department of Justice. Aria's stomach dropped. Just me, or you and Ethan both? He's waiting in conference room A. They met the federal agent together, Aria's hand steady on the folder of documents she'd prepared for exactly this possibility. The agent was in his 40s, professionally dressed, with the particular intensity of someone who'd spent years building cases. Mr. Cade, Miss Bennett. He shook their hands, his grip firm. I'm Special Agent Martinez. I'd like to talk to you about Evans and Cade's operations over the past several years. Are we under investigation? Ethan's voice was calm, controlled. Let's call it a review. We've been looking into international shipping operations that may have violated customs regulations, tax codes, and trade agreements. Evans and Cade's name has appeared in several contexts that raised questions. Aria and Ethan exchanged glances. They'd known this was possible, had prepared for it, but knowing and experiencing were different things. We're happy to cooperate, Aria said carefully. Evans and Cade has undergone significant restructuring over the past 18 months. We've implemented new compliance protocols, severed relationships with partners who couldn't meet our standards, and made substantial efforts to ensure all current operations meet legal requirements. Agent Martinez opened a folder, spread documents across the table. I'm aware. In fact, your cooperation with authorities regarding the Singapore trafficking network helped trigger a larger investigation that's led to several arrests. We appreciate that. We did what was right, Ethan said simply. You did what was smart too, distancing yourself from illegal operations before we could build a case linking you to them. Martinez's expression was unreadable. Here's the situation. We have evidence of regulatory violations and questionable partnerships involving Evans and Cade from 3 to 5 years ago. But we also have evidence of your cooperation with authorities, your restructuring efforts, and your voluntary severance of relationships with criminal networks. He closed the folder, leaned back. The question becomes, do we pursue charges for past operations, Or do we accept that you've genuinely reformed and focus our resources on current criminal enterprises? Aria's heart was pounding, but she kept her expression neutral. What would pursuing charges accomplish? Justice, theoretically. Accountability for past actions. Martinez's tone was thoughtful. But also years of expensive litigation, resources diverted from active investigations, and the destruction of a business that's currently operating legitimately and employing 200 people. And the alternative? Ethan asked. Continued cooperation, full transparency regarding your past operations and any associates who may still be engaging in illegal activities. Agreement to periodic audits to ensure you're maintaining legitimate operations. And a significant financial settlement to compensate for economic damages caused by your previous regulatory violations. It was, Aria realized, the closest thing to a deal they'd get. Not forgiveness, not exoneration, but a pragmatic recognition that reform had value. How significant? Ethan's businessman brain was already calculating. Martinez named a figure that made Aria wince. Not ruinous, but substantial. The kind of penalty that would hurt but wouldn't destroy them. Ethan looked at Aria, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded fractionally. This was the cost of the life they'd chosen, the price of moving from shadow to daylight. Acceptable, Ethan said. We'll cooperate fully, provide whatever documentation you need, and submit to auditing, in exchange for no criminal charges and the ability to continue our legitimate operations. I'll need that in writing, with your attorneys present, Martinez said. But yes, that's the framework we're offering. They spent the next 3 hours going through details, with lawyers joining via conference call, hashing out the specifics of cooperation and oversight. When Agent Martinez finally left, Aria felt like she'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. That went better than I expected, Ethan said, pouring them both whiskey from the bottle he kept in his office. We just agreed to pay millions of dollars and submit to federal oversight for the next 5 years. But we're not going to prison. We get to keep building what we've started. He handed her a glass. I'll take that deal. Aria took a long sip, the whiskey burning away some of the tension. Do you have regrets? About transitioning? About giving up the profitable gray areas? Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city through his office windows. A year ago, I would have said yes. The old way was profitable, exciting, built on being smarter than everyone else. He turned to face her. But now, no. Because the old way had an expiration date, and we're past it. If we'd kept going, we'd either be in prison or dead. This way, we get a future. A boring, legitimate future. With you in it. That's the opposite of boring. Despite everything, Aria smiled. Smooth talker. One of my many skills. He set down his glass, moved closer to her. Marry me. Aria nearly dropped her whiskey. What? Marry me. Be my partner officially, not just professionally. Build this future with me as my wife, not just my chief strategy officer. Ethan, we've been together less than a year. We've been through enough that time doesn't matter the same way. I know who you are in crisis. I know how you think, what you value, what you'll compromise on, and what you won't. I know I trust you more than I've trusted anyone, and I know I want to build the rest of my life with you. His eyes were serious, vulnerable. So yes, we've been together less than a year by the calendar, but we've lived several lifetimes in that time, and I don't want to wait anymore to make it official. Aria's mind was spinning, but her heart, her traitorous, hopeful heart, had already made the decision. This is insane. Probably. Is that a yes? You don't even have a ring. I'll buy you 10 rings, 20, whatever you want. Ethan took her hands, and his were shaking slightly, the only sign of nerves. Aria Bennett, will you marry me and help me build a life that's worth more than survival? She thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, invisible and drowning. She thought about all the compromises and dangerous choices that had brought her here. She thought about the future they were building, imperfect, complicated, but honest in a way that mattered. Yes, she said, and watched Ethan's face transform with a smile that was pure, uncomplicated joy. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her with the same intensity he'd brought to that first kiss in the Brooklyn safe house, but with something added: relief, happiness, hope. and Aria kissed him back, thinking about how strange it was that a life built from desperation had somehow become a life worth keeping. They married 3 months later in a small ceremony at City Hall, with Claire and a handful of employees as witnesses. Aria wore a dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, and Ethan wore a suit that made him look like exactly what he was, a legitimate businessman building something real. Her mother attended via video call, crying happy tears and telling Aria in 3 languages how proud she was. And when the judge pronounced them married, Aria felt something shift inside her. Not completion, exactly, but a sense of rightness, of pieces finally fitting together in a way that made sense. The restructuring continued, but with new momentum. Aria threw herself into building the consulting side of the business, leveraging her language skills and cultural understanding to help legitimate corporations navigate international markets. Ethan focused on the logistics operations, building relationships with above-board shipping companies and customs officials who appreciated working with a firm that didn't require them to look the other way. 2 years after the gala shooting, Evans and Cade had transformed completely. The gray area operations were gone, replaced by legitimate consulting contracts and logistics partnerships. The profit margins were smaller but stable, and more importantly, defensible. And the company employed 300 people in jobs that didn't require them to compromise their integrity. Aria was in her office reviewing a contract proposal when Ethan appeared with an expression that suggested either very good news or very interesting news. "Columbia called," he said. "They want to know if you'd be interested in teaching a seminar on international business communication." Aria looked up, surprised. "Columbia? As in my alma mater, Columbia?" "The same. Apparently your reputation in the field has gotten around. They think you'd be an asset to their linguistics program." He leaned against her desk. Part-time position, 1 seminar per semester, full academic credentials. It was everything Aria had dreamed of before life had derailed those dreams. The academic career she'd thought was lost forever, being handed back to her with an apology for the delay. "What do you think?" Ethan asked. "I think it would mean less time at Evans and Cade." "We can handle that. You've built systems that run themselves now. And honestly, having our chief strategy officer teaching at Columbia is good for business. It reinforces our legitimacy, shows we're contributing to the field beyond just profit." He smiled. "Plus, I know how much you miss the academic work. You light up when you talk about linguistic theory in a way you never do when discussing shipping manifests." Aria laughed because it was true. "You're sure you don't mind?" "I'm sure I want you to be happy. If teaching makes you happy, then teach." She accepted the position, and that fall found herself standing in front of a classroom full of graduate students, teaching them about the complexities of business communication across languages and cultures. She used real examples from her work, sanitized, of course, stripped of anything that would expose the darker history, and watched students' faces light up as they understood the power of precise translation. One student asked, near the end of the semester, "How did you get into this field? What made you choose international business communication?" Aria thought about all the answers she could give. The official story, the professional narrative. Instead, she chose honesty. "I became a translator because language was the only power I had when I had nothing else. I learned to see patterns in how people communicate because survival required it. And I ended up in business because someone gave me a chance when I was desperate enough to take it." She smiled. "The path wasn't what I planned, but it taught me that sometimes the detours teach you more than the straight roads ever could." The students nodded, taking notes, seeing her as a success story. And in a way, she was, just not the uncomplicated kind. That evening, she came home to the Tribeca penthouse to find Ethan cooking, something he'd started doing more often, claiming he needed a hobby that didn't involve hostile negotiations or financial restructuring. The kitchen smelled like garlic and wine and normalcy. "How was class?" he asked, not looking up from whatever he was sautéing. "Good. Strange. Wonderful." Aria poured herself wine, leaned against the counter watching him work. "I keep waiting for it to feel like a lie, like I'm an imposter playing professor while hiding what I really am." "And what are you really?" Ethan turned to look at her, his expression genuinely curious. "I don't know anymore. Translator, strategist, your wife. Someone who made compromises and is trying to do better." She took a sip of wine. "Someone still figuring out if redemption is possible or if we just get better at living with our choices." Ethan set down his spatula, moved to stand in front of her. I think redemption is what we make it. Not forgetting what we did, but choosing to do better going forward. Building something worth more than what we destroyed. Very philosophical for a Wednesday night. I have my moments. He kissed her forehead. For what it's worth, I think you're doing more than living with your choices. I think you're transforming them into something meaningful. The students you're teaching, the partnerships you're building, the life we're creating, that's not just survival. That's purpose. Aria set down her wine, wrapped her arms around him, let herself sink into the comfort of his presence. 5 years ago, she'd been invisible, drowning, convinced her life had peaked and was now just a slow decline into irrelevance. Now she stood in a penthouse kitchen, married to a man who'd seen her when no one else had, teaching at her dream university, building a business that actually helped people instead of exploiting them. The path had been dark, dangerous, full of compromises that still kept her awake some nights. But somehow, impossibly, it had led here, to purpose, partnership, a future she'd stopped dreaming about because dreaming hurt too much. I love you, she said quietly against Ethan's chest. I love you too. His arms tightened around her. And I'm grateful every day that you were cleaning my office floor at 5 a.m. and arrogant enough to think you could translate better than the professionals. Aria laughed, pulled back to look at him. Arrogant? I was desperate. You were both. It's one of your most attractive qualities. They ate dinner on the balcony, watching the city lights come on as darkness fell. Aria thought about all the people down there, living their lives, chasing their dreams, making their compromises. How many of them were where she'd been, invisible, desperate, one bad break from total collapse? How many of them would get the chance she'd gotten, or would they just keep drowning while the city moved on without noticing? I want to start a foundation, she said suddenly. Ethan looked at her, wine glass halfway to his mouth. A foundation? For immigrants, people rebuilding their lives in a new country, dealing with debt and language barriers and the 1,000 small ways the system makes survival harder than it should be. The idea was forming as she spoke, gaining clarity. Translation services, financial counseling, legal help navigating immigration issues, the kind of support I needed and never got. That's a significant undertaking. I know, but we have the resources now, and I have the experience to know what actually helps versus what sounds good, but does nothing. She turned to face him fully. I spent years invisible because I didn't speak the right way, didn't have the right connections, didn't know how to navigate systems designed to keep people like me out. I want to change that for others. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he smiled, genuine, proud. Okay, let's do it. We'll set it up as a nonprofit, fund it through Evans and Cade's charitable foundation. You'll run it however you think best. Just like that? Just like that. You've already transformed my business and my life. Might as well transform some other lives while you're at it. The foundation launched 6 months later, operating out of a small office in Queens, deliberately chosen because it was in a neighborhood full of immigrants struggling exactly the way Aria had struggled. She hired translators who'd been through the system, legal advocates who understood the maze of immigration law, financial counselors who knew how to navigate debt without shame. The first person they helped was a woman from Bangladesh, cleaning offices at night while trying to finish a nursing degree, drowning in debt from her father's medical bills. Aria sat across from her in the foundation office and saw herself 5 years earlier, desperate, exhausted, convinced the only way forward was to keep grinding until something broke. We're going to help you, Aria said in Bengali, watching the woman's eyes widen at hearing her native language. Not charity, partnership. We'll help you navigate the debt, connect you with resources, ensure you can finish your degree without destroying yourself. The woman cried, and Aria held her hand, remembering what it felt like to be invisible and suddenly seen. Over the next year, they helped 300 people. Some needed translation services, others needed legal help or financial counseling, or just someone who understood what it meant to rebuild a life in a country that didn't make it easy. And with each person they helped, Aria felt something shifting inside her, the weight of her own compromises lightening slightly. Not forgotten, but balanced against something better. 5 years after that first encounter in the hallway at 5 a.m., Aria stood at a podium in Columbia's linguistics building, giving the keynote speech at an international conference on business communication. The audience was full of academics, professionals, people who'd spent careers studying what she'd learned through survival. Language is power, she said, her voice carrying through the auditorium. But not just because it allows communication. Language is power because it shapes how we're seen, how we're valued, how we navigate systems that were often designed without us in mind. The immigrant who speaks perfect English gets treated differently than the immigrant with an accent, even though both may have identical skills and knowledge. The translator who can code switch between formal and informal registers has advantages the monolingual professional never thinks about. She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. I became a translator because I needed to survive. I became good at it because survival required excellence. And I'm standing here today not because I followed a traditional path, but because I learned to see opportunities in desperation and build something valuable from compromise. After the speech, a young woman approached her, mid-20s, nervous, with an accent that suggested Eastern Europe. Miss Cade, I just wanted to say thank you. Your foundation helped my family 2 years ago when we were drowning in debt. Because of you, I'm finishing my degree. I'm going to be a teacher. Aria felt her throat tighten. What's your name? Katya Volkov. Katya, you didn't need me to finish your degree. You had the strength and intelligence already. We just helped remove some obstacles. Aria smiled. But I'm glad we could help. And I'm proud of you. Katya left, and Aria stood in the hallway feeling the weight of what she'd built. Not just the foundation, not just the career, but the life that had emerged from desperation and darkness and dangerous choices. Not perfect, never perfect, but meaningful in ways she'd stopped believing possible. That night, she and Ethan hosted dinner at the penthouse for the foundation board. Claire, 2 academics from Columbia, an immigration lawyer, and a financial counselor who'd once been an undocumented immigrant himself. They ate, drank wine, discussed expansion plans and funding strategies and the 1,000 details of running an organization that actually helped people. After everyone left, Aria stood on the balcony watching the city, and Ethan joined her with fresh wine. Penny for your thoughts, he said. I was thinking about the woman I was 5 years ago, standing in this city feeling invisible, convinced I was disappearing into irrelevance. She turned to look at him. If someone had told her what life would look like now, she wouldn't have believed it. Would have thought it was a fairy tale, too good to be true. And now? Now I know it's not a fairy tale. It's complicated and imperfect and built on compromises I still wrestle with. Aria smiled. But it's real, and it's mine. Ours. We chose it, built it, earned it through survival and transformation, and refusing to stay in the darkness. Ethan pulled her close, and they stood together watching the city lights, the same lights that had watched Aria struggle, suffer, transform. The same city that had tried to make her invisible and had instead been the crucible that forged her into something stronger. I'm proud of you, Ethan said quietly, of who you've become, of what you've built. We built it together. No, I gave you opportunities. You transformed them into something meaningful. He kissed the top of her head. I used to think power was about control, about being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. You taught me that real power is about transformation, changing yourself, changing your circumstances, changing the world in small but meaningful ways. Aria thought about that, about the journey from desperate translator to professor to foundation director to partner in a business she'd helped transform from shadow to light, about the woman who'd been invisible and the woman she'd become, visible, valued, using her voice to help others find theirs. Do you have regrets? She asked. About the choices we made getting here? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I regret the people who got hurt along the way, the compromises that served us but harmed others, the years spent operating in shadows when we could have been building something better. He paused. But I don't regret meeting you. I don't regret the transformation, and I don't regret that we chose to do better once we understood better. That's not quite the same as redemption. Maybe redemption isn't about erasing the past. Maybe it's about using the lessons to build a better future. Ethan turned her to face him. We can't undo what we did, but we can make sure it wasn't pointless, that it taught us something worth knowing. Aria kissed him, tasting wine and hope and the particular flavor of hard-won wisdom. I love you, even when I'm not sure I should. I love you too, especially because you're not sure you should. He smiled against her lips. Keeps me honest. They went inside, leaving the balcony and the city lights behind. Tomorrow, Aria would teach her seminar, review foundation applications, work on strategies for Evans and Cade's expansion into new markets. Tomorrow, she would continue building the life she'd chosen from desperation and transform through determination. But tonight, she stood in the kitchen of a penthouse she'd once cleaned, married to a man who'd seen her when she was invisible, living a life she'd stopped believing possible. The journey had been dark, dangerous, full of compromises that would always complicate her sense of self. But she was here, visible, valued, using her voice and her skills to build something better than survival, something approaching purpose. The girl who'd crossed an ocean seeking opportunity had found it, though not in the form she'd imagined. The woman who'd been drowning in debt and invisibility had learned to swim, then learned to help others do the same. And the translator who'd once been hired to navigate shadows had helped guide them all into light. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real, earned, built from the rubble of desperation into something worth keeping. And as Aria fell asleep that night in Ethan's arms, in the bed they'd chosen together, in the life they'd built from darkness and compromise and stubborn hope, she finally understood what it meant to be truly seen. Not perfect, not innocent, but undeniably, powerfully, completely herself. And that, after everything, was enough.